Hey guys! Tonight we're slipping on our sandals and heading straight into the wild, weird and sometimes straight up stomach-turning world of ancient Roman cuisine. Let me be upfront, you probably won't survive this. Not because of a sword fight in the Colosseum or some dramatic imperial betrayal, but because your modern digestive system is absolutely not prepared for stuffed dormice dipped in honey or fish sauce that smells like it died twice. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and the current time in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're watching from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start your evening reclining in a lavish triclinium, one of those Roman dining rooms where guests lie around on couches in a triangle formation, surrounded by mosaic floors, oil lamps, and servants trained to move silently like culinary ghosts. You're wearing a toga you barely know how to fold, propped up on your left elbow like you've been doing this forever. The host, a wealthy patrician with suspiciously groomed eyebrows, raises his silver goblet in greeting. You nod back, trying to ignore the small plate set before you. It contains something rodent-shaped. That, your host explains with a flourish, is a dormouse. Not just any dormouse, but a fattened one, raised in a special clay jar called a glorarium. These little guys are pampered until they're plump, then stuffed with a mixture of minced pork, pepper, nuts, and, because it's Rome, liquefied fish guts known as garum. Then the whole thing's roasted or sometimes boiled, depending on how much crunch you're going for. You hesitate. Is this legal? Ethical? Alive? The dormouse is definitely not moving, but there's something about the crisp tail that makes you suspicious. You glance at the others, who are already popping theirs into their mouths like olives. You're being watched, so of course you do the same. The first bite is confusing. Sweet and savoury wrestle with an oily meatiness. There's a crunch, maybe a nut or maybe a bone, it's hard to tell. The garum creeps in on the back end like a bad memory, fishy and almost metallic. Still, you swallow. You're polite. Your host beams. As the courses begin to stack up, grilled lampreys, honey-glazed locusts, dates stuffed with peppered cheese, you notice the servants occasionally pouring something behind the curtain. Curious, you peek. There's a bucket, just a bucket. Some of the more ambitious guests are throwing up between courses, not discreetly. Apparently that's how you make room for more. They call it vomitorium, though, spoiler alert, that word never actually meant what modern people think it did. It referred to the exits in amphitheatres, not Roman purging rituals, but let's not let the truth get in the way of a good mental image. One guest, an aging merchant with gold-rimmed teeth, begins telling you about his favourite dormouse recipes. He recommends soaking them in honey wine before roasting. His friend, possibly drunk on wine mixed with seawater and saffron, one-ups him by describing a time he had dormouse cooked inside a fig, which was then wrapped in caul fat and deep-fried in olive oil. You nod, but you've mentally checked out somewhere around caul fat. Historically, dormouse were considered a true delicacy, especially among the upper crust. They were so popular that by the 1st century CE, they had their own farms, entire operations dedicated to producing the chubbiest, juiciest rodents possible. You imagine a dormouse gym, where the only exercise allowed is chewing. It's both hilarious and mildly horrifying. And yet, what's even stranger is how normalised all of this was. To the Romans, a dormouse wasn't weird. It was status, exotic, a conversation piece and a bite-sized power move. You weren't really elite unless your table squeaked. And here's your quirky sidebar. Romans didn't just eat dormice, they also occasionally wore them. There are fringe references to dormouse pelts being turned into tiny fur accessories. Think a little dormouse hat, maybe a scarf if you had 3 or 4, absolutely fashion-forward if you're into corpse couture. But of course, nothing in ancient Roman life came without contradiction. Scholars still debate whether these rodents were consumed widely or mostly reserved for show-off banquets. Some argue that evidence for dormice in poorer homes is slim to non-existent, suggesting this wasn't an everyday protein. Others point to scattered bones found in more humble kitchens, proposing that maybe, just maybe, the dormouse wasn't only for the elite after all. Still, the idea of slapping together a rodent pâté as a casual weekday snack feels like something you'd only do if you had the budget of a minor deity. The night stretches on, the courses keep coming. A poet stands up and reads a deeply uncomfortable elegy to a particularly delicious dormouse he once shared with a lover. No one finds this weird. You, somehow, are beginning not to either. As the oil lamps flicker low and your stomach protests softly from under your tunic, you think back to that first bite, the way it clashed with your expectations, the way it dared you to judge it, and you realise this isn't just a meal, this is a cultural statement, a Roman reminder that the boundaries between food and fear are always negotiable. South, you've survived the dormouse, sort of. Congratulations, just don't ask what's next on the platter. You wake up the next morning still tasting something vaguely rodent-adjacent on your breath, but there's no time to dwell on that. Today's assignment takes you into the fragrant, fermented heart of Roman food culture, garum. If you thought the dormouse was pushing your culinary boundaries, you're about to find out that the real star of Roman kitchens wasn't meat, or grain, or wine. It was fish sauce. Gloriously rank, salty, pungent, all-consuming fish sauce. And not just any sauce. Garum was practically a lifestyle. You walk through a bustling Roman port city, maybe Pompeii or even Ostia, and before you even see the ocean, you smell it. The scent is like 1,000 sardines having a shouting match. Salty air? Nope. That's garum processing plants in full swing, each one its own open-air experiment in what happens when you leave small fish to rot with herbs and salt under the Mediterranean sun. You approach one of these workshops, which really just looks like a sun-scorched patio covered in vats. Workers stir fish guts with long wooden paddles, occasionally stepping aside as the fermentation bubbles too enthusiastically. You gag, slightly, and that's from several feet away. Now imagine this smell clinging to your tunic, your hair, your dreams. A man wearing an apron crusted in salt crystals waves you over and offers a taste. It's garum of the finest kind, he says, made only from the innards of mackerel, cured in imported salt from Baetica, aged for months in clay amphorae, and stirred daily by a eunuch for balance. You take a cautious sip from a ceramic spoon. It's not just salty, it's oceanic. It's savoury and sour and a little sweet and slightly terrifying. You swallow it because you're being watched. Again. This isn't just any garum, it's garum sociorum, the top-shelf variety. Roman elites paid absurd amounts for this liquid gold, and there were entire brands, labels, even garum counterfeits. Poorer citizens used something closer to alec, the chunky sludge left over from garum making that might have doubled as grout in desperate times. Back in the forum, you watch people drizzle garum over everything. Bread, lentils, shellfish, even fruit. A child is eating figs soaked in it like some nightmare version of ketchup. Romans didn't care what the dish was. They just wanted that umami hit. And the craziest part? It kind of worked. Garum had the ability to make bland grains and dried legumes taste meaty, to stretch out flavour when meat was too expensive, and to mask the smell of food that was maybe past its prime. In other words, ancient MSG, but messier. And while garum was everywhere, its production was not a neighbourhood-friendly affair. Most garum factories were placed on the edge of towns or downwind for a reason. You imagine trying to rent an apartment next to one, charming view of the sea adjacent to artisanal fish rotters. Hard pass. Still, as you tour more kitchens, both elite and humble, you realise that the obsession was real. Some cooks kept small amphorae of garum hanging from their belts like culinary perfume. Others added it after cooking, like some folks do with a dash of soy sauce or Tabasco. It wasn't just an ingredient, it was a signature. And, here's your quirky side note for the night. There was actually a variety of garum made using dolphin blood. Yep. According to a few suspiciously specific recipes, dolphin blood mixed with herbs and spices was considered a potent health tonic. Whether it ever made it to the dinner plate is unclear, but someone somewhere had that idea and wrote it down with conviction. Of course, not everyone agrees on how garum was really made. Some scholars argue that the fish were cleaned and filleted before fermentation, creating a cleaner product. Others insist that everything, heads, tails, eyes, guts, was dumped into the mix. There's also debate over how widespread the finest grades were, and whether the average Roman ever got to taste more than the salty leftovers. Inscriptions on jars help, but archaeologists still bicker over what certain words mean. Was liquamen just another name for garum, or was it a cheaper imitation? Is Myria just brine, or a competitor brand. Academia has never fought harder over fish juice. You follow your nose to a nearby taberna, a Roman street food stall, where the day's special is a bowl of barley porridge topped with diced onions, crushed walnuts, and, you guessed it, a hearty pour of garum. The man serving it claims his recipe dates back to a general who marched with Caesar in Gaul. You eat a spoonful and it's not bad. It's weird, yes. It's got that earthy, funky aftertaste that makes your tongue ask questions your brain isn't ready to answer. But it's hearty. It's filling. It's Roman. By sunset, your toga smells like a bait shop and your breath could pickle olives. You've learned one key thing. In ancient Rome, garum wasn't optional. It was essential. A defining feature of taste and class and practicality, all rolled into one glistening, sloshing, salty sauce. It linked the kitchens of emperors and soldiers, nobles and slaves. And somehow, through sheer flavour violence, it made everything Roman food touched more Roman. You head home, the smell still clinging to your skin like a loyal sidekick. You lie down, wondering if you'll ever smell anything else again. Spoiler, you won't. Garum is forever. You wake up before dawn to the sound of a conch shell blowing somewhere in the distance, and despite the fish sauce hangover lingering in your sinuses, the day waits for no one. You've got another invitation, this time to the villa of a man who calls himself a curator of exotic palates, which is Roman code for very rich and very bored. His estate sits just beyond the city walls, all manicured gardens and imported marble, guarded by stone lions and real peacocks that scream like broken flutes every time someone walks too close. A servant greets you with a bow and hands you a cup of mulsum, sweet wine mixed with honey. You sip politely, wondering what's hiding behind that sugar. It doesn't matter. The host appears, waving his arms dramatically and ushering you into a colonnaded dining space dripping with opulence. This, he proclaims, gesturing toward the platter at the centre of the low table, is the flamingo. And these, he pauses for effect, are its tongues. Yes, tongues, flamingo tongues, grilled lightly, seasoned with cinnamon, cloves and a sprinkle of crushed myrtle berries. The aroma is strangely pleasant, but the idea, less so. You look at the bird, stripped of feathers, pinkish grey like an overboiled ham, legs crossed like it's politely napping, and then at the delicately arranged pile of tiny tongues, each one the size of a baby carrot if baby carrots had tasted sea brine their whole lives and died afraid. Flamingos were status birds in Rome. Not useful, not even particularly tasty according to some historians, but undeniably rare. That was the point. Romans were obsessed with culinary theatre, and nothing said I have conquered nature itself like putting a bizarre animal on your table. Peacocks, parrots, ostriches, and yes, flamingos, all fair game. But the tongue was the real prize, a tiny muscular delicacy thought to be both tender and symbolically rich. After all, what better dish to serve at a party of politicians than a platter of tongues? You take one and bite. It's rubbery, almost chewy like calamari, but with a strange undertone of pond water and ash. The spices help. The wine helps more. You chew slowly as your host tells the story of how the tongues were collected, plucked from several birds, then boiled, then grilled, then stewed in their own reduction before serving. It took 2 days, 7 servants, and at least one enormous lie told to a customs officer, all for a handful of bites that disappear in seconds. The conversation drifts toward the exotic. One guest boasts of having once eaten the heart of a giraffe. Another describes a banquet where each course came from a different continent. Rhinoceros from Africa, partridge from Gaul, snow from the Alps shaved into a wine slushy. It's clear now, this isn't about flavour, it's about spectacle. Who can say they ate the rarest, strangest, most mythical thing? That's what wins you applause in this circle. Here's a fun fringe fact to savour. In one Roman cookbook, attributed to the famously enigmatic Apicius, there's a recipe for boiled flamingo that ends with the instruction, serve with a vinegar and date sauce. Simple, brutal, Roman. And yet, despite how often flamingos and other exotic birds appear in elite food accounts, archaeological evidence for their widespread consumption is thin. Scholars still debate whether dishes like this were actually eaten often or just once in a while, used in literature and elite gossip to symbolise decadence rather than reality. Did senators really dine on flamingo tongues weekly? Or was it just the ancient world's version of saying, "Oh, you haven't tried foie gras"? Either way, the illusion was powerful. After the tongues come more birds, roasted swan, stuffed with olives and almonds, sparrows skewered whole and dipped in spiced honey, even a songbird casserole that sings no more. You chew on a tiny rib bone, wondering how many wings had to flap their last for this stew. Probably too many. You glance across the table and lock eyes with a man whose lips are stained purple from wine and whatever bird viscera he's been snacking on. He smiles. You smile back. You both know you've eaten something deeply unnecessary. That's part of the fun. As the meal stretches toward afternoon, music begins, a flutist and a singer performing an ode to the bird who gave his voice so that we may feast. It's weirdly touching. You almost tear up. Then someone throws a peacock feather at the singer and he trips over a stool. Back to reality. You're offered a final treat. Roasted goose tongue on a skewer, served with candied rose petals. You decline. Your jaw is tired and your moral compass is somewhere in the atrium weeping softly. The flamingo tongues were only the start. You now understand that in ancient Rome, eating wasn't just survival or even enjoyment. It was performance, status, theatre, sometimes cruelty, sometimes brilliance. And while the debate continues over whether some of these dishes were ever actually served or simply imagined in decadent literature, one thing is clear. If it had a pulse, the Romans probably tried to eat it, or at least write a poem about someone who did. You step out into the sunlight again, blinking against the glare, the cries of real flamingos echoing from the ornamental pond. They wade cautiously, as if they've read the menu. By now you're beginning to suspect that nothing in a Roman kitchen was safe from experimentation, not even the family pet, or in this case, the aquatic kind. Today, your curiosity leads you to the estate of Licinius, a wealthy equestrian with an unhealthy obsession with eels. Not just eating them, though that's certainly part of it, but collecting them, naming them, and allegedly whispering to them. You're not sure what to expect when you arrive, but you definitely don't expect a man in a crimson tunic leading you by the hand to an ornamental pond, beaming like a proud parent. Inside the shallow water, you see dozens of eels gliding back and forth, their slick, sinuous bodies catching sunlight like dark ribbons. Licinius claps his hands and calls out names. Lucilla! Agrippina! Pulcher! And horrifyingly, a few of them actually swim toward him. You're about to ask if you've been invited to a dinner or a séance when he casually mentions that some of the eels respond to music. Sure enough, a servant begins plucking a lyre nearby, and the pond ripples as the creatures seem to gather in one corner, like they've been summoned to a secret meeting. Licinius offers you a drink and launches into his favourite topic, how eels are misunderstood. They are clever, he insists, much more so than dogs, and they can live for decades if treated well, but, he sighs dramatically, the true test of friendship is whether you're willing to eat them. Wait, what? You follow him into the kitchen, where a giant clay pot of water is being stirred. Inside, more eels. But these are not for show. These are destined for the grill. Licinius explains that the trick is to kill them just before cooking. Anything earlier makes the flesh too tough. One servant grabs a wriggling eel with tongs and gives it a swift blow to the head before dunking it in a boiling broth spiced with coriander, lovage, pepper, and a splash of, you guessed it, garum. The smell is briny, earthy, and weirdly enticing. You sit down to a long marble table set with silverware and surprisingly few prayers. Licinius slaps down a plate with a whole eel curled like a sleepy dragon, charred and glistening, the skin still twitching slightly. You hesitate. Again. This is becoming a pattern. But under his intense gaze, you take a bite. It's oily, it's rich. There's a soft, buttery texture to the meat, almost like smoked salmon if it had a guilt complex. It's not bad. In fact, you kind of get it. Why Roman elites saw eels not just as food, but as trophies. Still, part of you wonders if Lucilla just watched her cousin get devoured, and whether Licinius will cry about it later. The ancient Roman fascination with eels wasn't limited to dinner plates. Historical records mention upper-class Romans keeping them in decorative ponds and feeding them scraps, even training them to eat from their hands. There are bizarre accounts of men mourning the death of specific eels, and one infamous story tells of a nobleman who adorned his favourite with earrings. There's even darker gossip, possibly exaggerated or entirely invented, about enemies being thrown into eel tanks as punishment. though most historians agree that's more myth than menu. And yet, the practice of raising eels for both companionship and consumption was very real. They were affordable enough for the middle class, elegant enough for the rich, and creepy enough to be unforgettable. Romans even bred them in controlled environments, creating elaborate fish pond systems with fresh and saltwater inflows to maintain the ideal flavour and consistency. Some of these aquaculture setups were marvels of engineering, complete with sluice gates and underground pipes, all to pamper their future entrees. Here's a fringe fact that's as disturbing as it is fascinating. The Roman writer Vettius Pollio reportedly kept a tank of flesh-eating eels into which he threw disobedient slaves. Whether this is truth, exaggeration, or slander, we may never know. But even Pliny the Elder raised his eyebrows at that one. And when Pliny thinks you're going too far, you've truly arrived. As with everything in Roman life, there's scholarly disagreement over just how widespread this eel madness really was. Some argue it was a niche obsession among the ultra-rich, like owning a tiger or collecting cursed gemstones. Others believe it reflected broader Roman views of nature, as something to be tamed, consumed, and aestheticized. The lines between pet, prize, and plate were disturbingly flexible. Back at the villa, you try not to make eye contact with the surviving eels as dessert arrives. Figs dipped in honey and fried eel skins, still slightly crackling. The servants clear away the bones, and Licinius offers you a jar labelled eel liver paste, which you graciously pretend to mishear. Outside, the pond glows with torchlight as the eels swim in hypnotic circles, seemingly unaware that they live in a Roman contradiction, loved and devoured, named and filleted. You leave the villa feeling vaguely amphibious yourself, sloshing slightly from all the wine and eel oil. As you walk past the pond, one of the eels lifts its head slightly from the water and blinks at you. You blink back. There's a moment of mutual understanding. You really hope that wasn't Lucilla. Morning finds you wandering through the shaded outer courtyard of another grand domus, your sandals sticking faintly to the mosaic floor, still coated in some residual eel grease you haven't quite scrubbed off. The air smells sweeter here, though. Warm, thick with the scent of honey, cinnamon, and some kind of roasting meat that doesn't instantly scream, aquatic nightmare. A good sign, probably. You're greeted by a hostess in flowing saffron robes who introduces tonight's theme, Birds of the Empire. You've barely processed that phrase when someone places a goblet of date wine into your hand and gestures toward a large terracotta oven that looks more like a mausoleum than a kitchen appliance. Inside, something enormous is roasting slowly on a spit. It's an ostrich, a whole one. Neck looped into an elegant curve, skin brushed with olive oil and honey until it glistens like burnished bronze. The chef, bald, sweaty, and visibly proud, walks around the bird, basting it methodically with a sauce made of sweet wine, ground pepper, and just a hint of cumin. You try to calculate how many people this meal is meant to serve, but the math doesn't work. You could feed a minor legion with one ostrich. Instead, it's destined for 8 reclining elites and you. A feather is still stuck to one of the legs. The first slice lands on your plate with a satisfying thunk. It looks like dark turkey, but smells faintly like licorice. You cut in slowly, chewing the first bite as the others dive in with seasoned enthusiasm. The meat is dense, gamey, a little dry, but surprisingly tasty once you ladle some of the spiced honey sauce on top. A steward spoons out roasted chickpeas glazed in vinegar and beetroot puree, and you almost forget you're chewing on something with eyeballs the size of gobstoppers. Historically, ostrich was one of several exotic birds Roman elites adored for both their novelty and their size. If you were looking to impress guests, or simply send the message that your appetite ignored the laws of nature, an ostrich would do the trick. But it wasn't just about roasting the bird whole. Oh no. The Romans had recipes for ostrich stew, ostrich liver mash, and one particularly elaborate concoction where the neck was stuffed with chopped herbs, minced meats, and pine nuts, then served as its own grotesque centerpiece, like a meat-filled noodle wearing a beak. A woman next to you recounts a tale she heard about a banquet in Alexandria where they served ostrich brains whipped into a mousse. Whether that was real or a culinary urban legend is up for debate. You take a polite sip of pomegranate cordial and quietly hope no one asks your opinion on brains. The taste of sweet and savoury begins to blur. Every dish seems to have honey somewhere in it. It's in the glaze, the stuffing, even the flatbread, which arrives topped with a drizzle of honey mixed with crushed rose petals and sprinkled with poppy seeds. One guest calls it dessert you eat before the main course. Another says the bread makes him feel like a Greek god on vacation. You say nothing, your tongue still coated in ostrich grease and floral syrup. And speaking of sweetness, here's your quirky historical detour. Romans believed in balancing extremes, so they often paired fatty meats with acidic or sugary sauces to cleanse the palate. They also had a thing for dishes that messed with your senses, salty desserts, spicy fruits, and one infamous recipe that involved milk, honey, and crushed pine cones, allegedly to awaken the brain. Spoiler, it probably just made you cough. Back at the table, someone signals the arrival of the next dish, grilled crane served in a fig and fish sauce reduction. You mentally prepare for the collision of land, air, and sea happening on your plate. The crane is sinewy, darker than the ostrich, with a texture like overworked duck. The sauce is sweet and sour, and somehow still manages to sneak in that familiar punch of fermented fish. At this point, your taste buds have given up trying to file complaints. Some historians argue that dishes like these, ostrich, crane, peacock, weren't common but reserved for high-profile feasts where showing off mattered more than satisfying hunger. Others suggest the recipes were exaggerated or symbolic, appearing in literature as examples of decadence rather than daily dining. Still, archaeological digs have unearthed ostrich bones in Roman kitchen waste heaps, lending weight to the idea that at least some people really were chowing down on these overgrown birds. What complicates the picture further is the cross-cultural fusion happening on these menus. Many of these flavours, dates, cumin, cinnamon, even ostrich meat, came from Egypt, Syria, and beyond. Rome was a culinary sponge, soaking up whatever it conquered and calling it refined. You're essentially eating an empire tonight, one bite at a time. As the sun dips, below the courtyard walls and oil lamps flicker to life, the hostess announces a finale dish: sweet ostrich pudding. You're not sure how that works, but it turns out to be a mixture of ground ostrich meat, crushed almonds, honey and wine, baked into something resembling a meat cake. The texture is disturbing. The flavour is ambitious. You chew slowly, not because you're savouring, but because your brain refuses to believe this isn't a prank. Still, there's something undeniably impressive about the whole affair. The sheer effort, the pageantry, the twisted elegance of transforming a giant flightless bird into a dozen different expressions of wealth, creativity and cultural conquest. Even if your stomach is deeply confused, your mind is a little awed. You lean back on your cushion, watching the last scraps of ostrich disappear from the platters. Somewhere nearby, a flute begins to play a slow, warbling tune. You think of the ostrich, massive, flightless, once thundering across a savannah, now reduced to pudding. You feel a little sorry for it, but also strangely full. You're still digesting your ostrich pudding, or trying to, when you find yourself ushered into a darker, more intimate triclinium, the kind reserved for after-dinner entertainment or surprise courses. You're not sure which applies until a servant appears carrying a domed silver platter the size of a small shield. Your stomach lets out a warning groan. The host for this particular gathering, a retired general with the permanent smirk of someone who's seen too much and regrets none of it, taps his spoon against a goblet and grins. "I hope," he says, "you're in the mood for something theatrical." That's your cue to start worrying. With a flourish, the lid is lifted, revealing what looks like a whole roasted pig. It's golden, glistening, and artfully posed with its legs tucked and mouth slightly open. At first glance, it seems like a showpiece, something sculpted for effect more than for eating. Then you see it twitch, just a little, and then chirp. From within the pig's mouth, a small bird flutters out, then another, and another, sparrows, finches, something with a blue crest you can't quite identify. They flap into the air in a chaotic burst, sending feathers and gasps flying in equal measure. Your host cackles with glee. "A little Roman magic," he says, raising his arms like he's just pulled off the world's weirdest card trick. The pig, you quickly realise, was gutted and hollowed out, then stuffed with live birds, spices and, because why not, a small burning cone of incense. It's part feast, part prank, and 100% Roman flair. Everyone claps. You sit there with your mouth open, wondering if any animal in this empire ever just got to die quietly. This was a popular gag among the culinary elite. The dish, referred to by some sources as porcus troianus, or Trojan pig, was designed to wow, to amuse, and if we're being honest, to horrify. Much like the Trojan horse it references, it hides surprises within surprises. Sometimes it was filled with live birds, sometimes sausages or other smaller cooked animals. A pig, inside a goat, inside a cow? Sure, why not? Culinary nesting dolls were the rage, and Roman chefs competed to one-up each other with increasingly absurd edible reveals. The taste, when you finally get a slice, is decent. Tender pork, lightly smoked from the incense, infused with whatever herbs and fruit were also tossed into the cavernous belly. But taste isn't the point. It's all about spectacle, presentation. You're not eating to nourish, you're eating to say, I was there when the pig gave birth to doves. Here's the quirky twist for this round. A variation of this dish reportedly involved stuffing a pig with a cooked animal, then reassembling the original animal to appear whole again, making it look untouched until someone sliced in and revealed the grotesque, meaty nesting surprise. Think of it as the Roman turducken, but with more deception and significantly fewer health codes. It wasn't uncommon for diners to applaud the reveal like it was a theatre performance. Food, in these elite circles, often was the entertainment. But here's where things get interesting. Historians still argue over how often this kind of culinary theatre actually occurred. Was it a regular feature of upper-class dining, or just literary exaggeration used by satirists like Juvenal and Petronius to mock Rome's bloated opulence? Some scholars believe these grotesque menus were more fantasy than reality, embellishments designed to criticise the moral decay of the elite. Others point to archaeological evidence of intricate kitchen tools and preserved animal bones that suggest, at least sometimes, this madness really happened. Roman banquets were not your average backyard barbecue. The general passes around a cup of spiced wine and chuckles as the last of the birds settle on a nearby beam. That one's trained, he says proudly, pointing to a particularly fat sparrow pecking at a fig. It always comes back for dessert. You stare at it, wondering if it knows it's living on borrowed time. As the night winds down, the final course is served. Not more meat, thank the gods, but a fruit compote shaped like a piglet. It jiggles slightly as it's sliced, revealing layers of honey-drenched apricots and pomegranate seeds nestled in a sweet barley paste. Somehow, it's a relief. You've gone from live bird explosions to fruit pudding moulded like livestock, and at this point, it actually feels normal. What stays with you, though, isn't the flavour. It's the theatre of it all. The absurdity of using food not just to feed, but to dazzle, confuse, even mess with your head. In Rome, the meal didn't end when your stomach was full. It ended when the audience clapped, when the host grinned, when someone said, "Did that pig just chirp?" As you step back, into the night air, the sound of feathers rustling somewhere behind you, you realise this was never just about food. It was about power. The power to waste, the power to amaze, the power to turn dinner into legend, and you've only seen the appetizer of Rome's edible eccentricities. You're lying on a marble bench in the garden of a villa, staring up at the stars and regretting every major decision that led you to a pig that breathed birds. But your digestive trials are far from over. A servant appears as if conjured from the shadows, whispers something about the final indulgence of the evening, and gestures for you to return indoors. You drag yourself up, your toga now faintly crusted with garum and honey, and shuffle behind him toward the atrium where yet another table is set. This time, thankfully, for fewer guests and dimmer lighting. Intimate? Yes. Merciful? Unlikely. Your host tonight is a woman of considerable elegance and sharp cheekbones, the kind of Roman matron who commands a room with a raised eyebrow and a single olive. She welcomes you warmly, offering a clay cup of herbal tisane, but quickly cuts to the chase. "You've heard of sow's womb, haven't you?" she asks, her tone suggesting that if you haven't, you've been living under a pile of amphoro. You try to play it cool, mutter something about how you've read about it in scrolls. She smiles and claps her hands. A servant brings in a shallow bronze dish covered by a linen cloth. Beneath it, what looks like a coiled, pinkish cut of meat, steam rising gently. It's glossy, soft-looking, almost like a jellyfish had a love affair with a smoked ham. "Sow's womb," she says proudly, braised in spiced wine stuffed with pine nuts, pepper and a drizzle of honey. You stare at it, trying not to imagine what part of the anatomy this once did, or how long ago. You're informed that this is a delicacy, reserved for the refined palate and those unafraid to embrace the richness of Roman culinary ingenuity. The womb has been carefully cleaned, blanched, and simmered for hours, then filled with a mixture of minced pork, crushed nuts, and dried fruit. The dish is then tied off like a sausage and slow-cooked until the fat renders into the meat, infusing the stuffing with a richness that's apparently unparalleled. The texture is complicated. Your first bite is soft to the point of discomfort, like biting into a warm, meaty marshmallow. The flavour, however, is surprisingly delicate, sweet from the wine, nutty from the filling, and gently aromatic from the myrrh sprinkled over the top. It's not unpleasant, just confrontational. The kind of dish that grabs you by the collar and whispers, "I used to be a uterus and now I'm art." Historically, sow's womb was one of the more controversial cuts in Roman cuisine. To modern sensibilities, it may sound like a culinary dare gone too far, but in ancient Rome, it was celebrated as a luxurious and highly desirable offering. The Roman gourmet Apicius, that eternal name-dropper of culinary extravagance, includes multiple preparations of sow's womb in his writings. One method calls for boiling it with leeks and spices before flash-frying it in olive oil, then finishing it with vinegar and fish sauce. Nothing subtle, nothing held back. And here's the wild twist. Romans didn't just eat this part of the animal for flavour, they believed it carried medicinal and even aphrodisiac properties. A well-cooked womb was said to restore virility, balance the humours, and, according to one enthusiastic senator, ignite the loins of the weary, which is frankly more than most modern multivitamins can promise. There are even rumours, fringe, yes, but documented, that wombs from pregnant sows were considered especially valuable. The idea was that such a dish contained double nourishment. One organ, two lives. It was symbolic. It was grotesque. It was deeply, unmistakably Roman. As you push your half-finished plate away, your hostess leans in and recounts her favourite tale. A nobleman in Capua who insisted on having sow's womb at every meal, even breakfast. The man died apparently mid-chew, but not before shouting, "This is living." Some say the line was made up after the fact. Others believe it's written on his tomb. Still, not everyone agreed on the delicacy's status. Roman medical writers, those perennially suspicious of pleasure, warned that consuming too much fatty organ meat could overheat the blood and lead to dreams of unnatural creatures. One scribe even claimed to have hallucinated a talking boar after eating spoiled sow's womb. Scholars remain divided over whether he meant this literally or just had a flair for drama. You notice other guests around the table quietly pushing their portions around with their spoons. One woman makes a brave attempt at a second bite, but you can see the battle happening behind her eyes. Your hostess, meanwhile, is already halfway through hers, humming softly as if to say, "You peasants will never understand." The meal ends not with dessert, but with a cleansing herbal digestif made from fennel, rue and aniseed, designed to cut the fat, as one servant puts it. You drink it greedily, not so much for the health benefits as for the hope it will erase the texture memory currently seared into your brain. As you step out into the cool night air, belly full of mysteries and unspoken regrets, you can't help but admire the audacity. The Romans didn't flinch from any part of the animal. In fact, they exalted the oddest bits, the overlooked, the cast-off, the biologically unsettling. They made them stars. They wrote recipes. They built reputations. And they dared their guests to keep up. You're not sure if you passed the test, but you made it through. And you didn't hallucinate a talking boar. Yet. You wake up to birdsong and the distant clatter of amphora being moved, an oddly peaceful backdrop considering you still feel like your stomach is quietly filing grievances against the Roman Empire. Today's culinary exploration begins in a slightly different setting. A quiet countryside villa, tucked between olive groves and vineyards, where a former senator has retired to the simple life of growing grapes, debating stoicism, and apparently farming snails. Yes, snails. You're led around the back of the estate where rows of small raised stone enclosures, something between a garden bed and a crypt, hold clusters of snails crawling lazily over cabbage leaves and fruit scraps. The old senator, dressed in worn linen and wearing the calm smile of someone who's moved past flamingo tongues, gestures proudly at his slimy crop. They take time, he says, but the Romans don't mind waiting for pleasure. You raise an eyebrow, watching one of the snails attempt to climb over a rock and fall back, with what you're almost certain is dramatic flair. These snails aren't just any garden pests. They're Helix pomatia, a species prized for their size and, after proper fattening, their flavour. The Romans took snail farming to an oddly meticulous level. Snails were collected in the wild or bred in enclosed gardens called cochlearia. Once housed, they were placed on a strict diet of milk, wine must, and occasionally ground grain. The goal? Fat snails with delicate, flavourful flesh. You crouch beside the enclosure, holding one gently in your hand. It recoils, then slowly extends two cautious antennae in what feels like a challenge. A servant arrives with a shallow bowl and nods toward a small stone stove set up nearby. Today you're going from farm to table in about 20 feet. The snails are washed, purged, a delicate euphemism for fasting, then simmered in a broth of white wine, lovage, and chopped leeks. You're handed a small bronze pick and instructed to dig the meat from the shell. The texture is chewy, the flavour earthy and faintly nutty, like someone tried to make a mushroom out of muscle tissue. You don't hate it. Snails, despite their humble appearance, were considered a delicacy in certain Roman circles, especially when prepared with flair. A proper snail dish at a dinner party could impress guests not by shock value. There were no birds flying out of pigs here, but by subtlety. Knowing how to season snails properly was a sign of refinement. You weren't just throwing gold leaf on a roasted peacock, you were coaxing flavour from a creature that spent most of its life eating rotting lettuce. And here's your quirky fact of the day. Some Roman snails grew so large that their shells were later repurposed as salt cellars, drinking cups, or, according to one very fringe source, as protective charms worn on leather cords. The idea was that the spiral shape had mystical properties tied to the cosmos. Imagine carrying around your dinner's old apartment as a necklace. Fashion, folks. Still, scholars debate how widespread snail farming really was. Some claim it was mostly a rural, seasonal indulgence, something you might do in retirement, like gardening. Others point to literary accounts and archaeological remains suggesting that snail dishes appeared regularly in wealthier urban homes, particularly when fresh meat was scarce, or one simply wanted to show off culinary subtlety. The question remains, was snail farming a quirky hobby of eccentric gourmands, or a genuine culinary trend that slimed its way into mainstream Roman dining? Back in the villa, more snails are served, this time baked into little clay pots with barley, herbs, and a hint of cheese. The smell is surprisingly rich, like forest floor meets fondue. You take a few bites, more curious now than squeamish. They're better than expected. Or maybe you've just reached the phase where your palate has given up resisting. The senator pours you a glass of wine made from his own vineyard, dry, crisp, and thankfully snail-free, and tells you about a feast he once attended where snails were dyed with beet juice to make them more appetizing. You nod solemnly, as if that makes perfect sense, and suddenly the snail doesn't seem so strange, not after everything else. It's small, slow, humble. It doesn't chirp or bleed or come with a backstory about being named after someone's grandmother. It just slides into your mouth and asks very little in return. As the sun begins to dip, casting long golden shadows across the vineyard, you sit with your host beneath a fig tree, sipping wine and chewing thoughtfully on the last of your snail-stuffed barley cake. The moment is quiet, peaceful. Not exactly what you expected from a day that started with a tour of slimy terrariums, but that's Rome for you, finding decadence even in the slowest, smallest things. Before you leave, the senator gives you a snail shell polished to a glossy shine. For balance, he says cryptically, and then returns to his garden with the air of someone who has truly figured life out. You slip the shell into your pouch and walk back toward the city, your steps slower now. Whether from the wine or the snails, you feel oddly grounded and only slightly queasy. It's barely mid-morning and you already smell like a fish market that took a wrong turn into an apothecary. You're trudging through the narrow streets of ancient Rome's Subura district, guided by the scent of vinegar, seawater, and something you're pretty sure is formaldehyde but with more tentacles. You're heading toward a seedy little tavern tucked behind a grain warehouse, a place known more for feeding the desperate than impressing the elite. Today's mission, jellyfish, that's not a metaphor, actual jellyfish, pickled, plated and served with a side of questionable enthusiasm. When you arrive, the place is predictably grim, dark, humid, with stone walls dripping condensation and a single window that's more a suggestion than an architectural feature. A hunched cook greets you by slamming a heavy clay jar onto the table. It sloshes. A pale, quivering blob floats inside, preserved in vinegar and salt water. You're told it's been soaking for days, maybe longer. Improves the texture, the cook says, as if jellyfish ever needed help being more gelatinous. You're handed a wooden skewer and a small plate of lemon slices. No fanfare, no spices, no sweet glaze to hide behind this time. You skewer the jellyfish tentatively. It offers just enough resistance to remind you it's not tofu. The texture is what you expected and somehow worse. It's like chewing on seawater-flavoured cartilage. Cold, slimy and disturbingly crunchy at the same time. You chase it down with a gulp of barley beer that tastes vaguely of smoke and regret. Jellyfish, it turns out, were occasionally eaten in Rome, especially in the coastal towns where people had easy access to the sea and fewer food choices. Though not a staple of the elite, pickled jellyfish popped up in the kind of down-market eateries where variety wasn't the point. Survival was. They weren't grilled, seasoned, or transformed into a spectacle. They were pickled, slapped on a plate, and shoved at whoever looked the hungriest. But even stranger is the fact that some Roman physicians actually prescribed jellyfish for medicinal use. They believed it could treat sunburns, soothe sore joints, and, bizarrely, improve virility if consumed regularly. One source even suggests it was dried into strips and carried as a kind of health charm. Whether this was science or superstition is anyone's guess, but it does give new meaning to the term jelly legs. After finishing your portion, the cook offers you the daily special, sea urchin stew. You know better than to ask what's in it, but curiosity wins. The bowl arrives steaming, thick with chunks of urchin roe, chopped herbs and breadcrumbs. The smell is heavy, briny, eggy, faintly metallic. You take a cautious sip. It tastes like a tide pool that someone set on fire and tried to extinguish with garlic. It's not bad exactly, it's just defiant, unapologetically oceanic, and yet urchins were considered a genuine delicacy by certain Roman diners. The Roman author Pliny the Elder, yes, him again, described them as an aphrodisiac, prized for their flavour and their supposed ability to spark passion. The rich often had them served raw, scooped straight from the spiny shell with a dab of vinegar or just a sprinkle of salt. They believed that freshness was everything. The urchin had to be alive minutes before being cracked open. You briefly consider how many things you've eaten this week that were probably alive while being served. Here's your fringe culinary gem. Some elite Roman banquets included jellyfish and sea urchins moulded into gelatinous terrines. Imagine a jiggling dome of seafood suspended in aspic, served as a centerpiece, possibly decorated with mint or edible flowers. These were not everyday dishes, but extravagant curiosities, designed to intrigue or possibly challenge the courage of your guests. You don't eat jellyfish because it tastes good, you eat it because you can. As you finish your meal, the cook tells you about an old recipe he's trying to revive. Jellyfish fried in oil and served with vinegar-soaked onions. He says the trick is getting the batter to stick. You nod with the expression of someone who will absolutely not try that, but respects the ambition. Then comes the scholarly wrinkle. Historians are still uncertain how common jellyfish actually were in Roman cuisine. Mentions in classical texts are rare and often ambiguous. Did sea creature mean jellyfish? Or some kind of soft-shelled mollusk? Were these things truly consumed widely? Or are we reading way too much into one eccentric cook's shopping list? The lack of clear archaeological evidence makes it tough to say. But whether widespread or niche, the fact remains that some Romans did look at a floating sea ghost and think, I could eat that. You step out of the tavern into sunlight that feels harsher than usual. Your skin smells faintly of brine, your fingers sticky with sea urchin roe, and your stomach gurgling like it's trying to file a formal complaint with the Senate. Still, there's something oddly admirable about the experience. The Romans didn't shy away from texture, from strong flavours, or from eating things most people would avoid stepping on. They embraced the ocean's weirdest gifts and found a place for them on the table. And when they couldn't make it taste better, they just soaked it in vinegar and dared you to complain. As you walk back toward the more polished neighbourhoods of the city, you pass a fishmonger pouring fresh seawater into a bucket of twitching mollusks. He looks up, grins, and offers you a handful. You politely decline. One miracle digestion per day is enough. You've barely recovered from your jellyfish encounter when you're marched, willingly, sort of, out of the city walls with a band of Roman legionaries. The heat hits like a blanket soaked in lava. You're in the middle of a dusty training camp somewhere in North Africa, and your nose is already filled with equal parts sand, sweat, and something else. Something toasted, charred, a little nutty. You follow your stomach more than your brain toward a small mess station, where a few off-duty soldiers are gathered around a fire pit, skewering insects on sharpened twigs like they're preparing for the world's weirdest cookout. Locusts, says one of them, grinning as he flips a cluster of crispy legs over the flames. High in protein, fast to catch, better than boiled grain any day. He offers you one as casually as someone might pass a piece of jerky. It's golden brown, coated in a dusting of cumin and salt, and still has tiny antennae. You chew it, because this is your life now, and it crunches, like a toasted almond that's also trying to fight back. Honestly, not bad, especially if you ignore what it looked like 10 seconds ago. Insects like locusts and beetle larvae were, in some regions, an ordinary part of the Roman diet, not because of novelty or decadence, but because they were practical. You're a long way from the honey-roasted dormice of the capital now. Here, in the outposts and military camps, the Roman diet is built on whatever you can trap, forage or dry for later. That means insects, desert lizards, bitter wild greens, and yes, more dried pulses than you ever want to see again. A soldier pulls something from his leather satchel and hands it to you. A small cake made of mashed chickpeas, dried dates, crushed grasshoppers, and a drizzle of honey. It's dense, chewy, oddly satisfying, and gives you flashbacks to energy bars from some nightmare grocery store aisle. We call it Militarium Turricula, he jokes, though you're pretty sure he just made that name up on the spot. Still, it gets the point across. This is field food. Efficient, filling, portable. Gourmet? Not even close. But when you're marching 20 miles a day in leather sandals, your standards evolve quickly. And it's not just the soldiers. You learn that in drier regions of the empire, especially across Egypt, Judea, and parts of North Africa, locals routinely harvested locusts and other insects not just as survival food, but seasonal staples. They'd be roasted, sun-dried, or boiled, and then mixed into stews or preserved in vinegar. Wealthy Romans visiting these areas often wrote about it with a mix of revulsion and fascination, as if eating bugs was something only the provincial or desperate did. Meanwhile, back home, they were munching sow's womb stuffed with pine nuts. So let's not get judgy. Here's a weird but real historical detail. Some Romans believed roasted locust had medicinal properties, especially for throat ailments. Pliny the Elder, who honestly had a take on everything short of interplanetary travel, claimed that locust ashes mixed with wine could cure mouth ulcers. Did it work? Probably not. But if you're desperate and out of options, tossing a few toasted grasshoppers into your goblet doesn't seem that crazy anymore. One of the younger soldiers sits beside you and offers his own recipe. Dried beetle larvae mixed into a grain porridge with fig syrup. Tastes like nuts, he insists, popping a few into his mouth with such nonchalance it makes your stomach do a slow somersault. You try one. He's not entirely wrong. They're earthy, meaty, and, if you squint your taste buds, almost like roasted hazelnuts. Almost. The kind of thing you'd snack on absent-mindedly until someone reminded you where it came from. But of course the scholarly debate rages on. Were insects a widespread accepted part of Roman diets, or merely a regional necessity glossed over in elite writings? Some argue that the silence in major Roman cookbooks, like Apicius, suggests that insects were too low status to even mention. Others believe their omission was intentional, that elite texts purposely ignored peasant foods to maintain a certain culinary aesthetic. After all, you don't build a legacy of excess with beetle stew. Yet, the archaeological evidence doesn't lie. Pits of locust shells, remnants of insect traps, even pictorial references in border territories all point to bugs being eaten more commonly than ancient menus admit. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't literary, it was just food. By midday, you're leaning against a cart, sipping a tepid brew of watered wine and nibbling on a honeyed cricket cake, trying not to think too hard about what's wedged between your teeth. The legionaries laugh and swap recipes, clearly more at ease with this diet than you'll ever be. One of them jokes about sneaking roasted scorpions into an officer's breakfast, a prank that apparently got him whipped and promoted in the same week. Roman logic. As you prepare to head back toward civilization, or at least toward fewer insect legs, you can't help but feel a grudging admiration for the sheer adaptability of the Roman palate. From palaces to provinces, they found a way to eat anything that moved, swam, crawled, or buzzed. And while you're not planning to carry a pouch of dried crickets with you, you're also not judging anyone who does. You pass a boy roasting grasshoppers on a flat rock, humming a tune, completely unbothered by the world. You smile. He offers you one, and you take it without hesitation. Crunch, salty, smoky, familiar. You're becoming disturbingly good at this. You're back in Rome proper now, wandering the echoing halls of a patrician villa that smells faintly of sandalwood, crushed figs, and something less pleasant, something almost like scorched feathers. You follow the scent through a series of marble columns and silk curtains until you reach a dining room arranged for a private midday feast. There's a low hum of conversation, punctuated by the occasional cackle from a guest who's definitely had too much Falernian wine. The host is a former consul with the kind of voice that makes everything sound like a decree, and he greets you with a grin and a single cryptic phrase. Today, we dine on genius. That's never a good sign. The first course is placed before you on a gleaming silver tray. A bird's head, beak intact, stares up at you from a pool of dark sauce. You blink. The server explains, quite casually, that you're looking at peacock brain, poached in wine, seasoned with cinnamon and black pepper, and served with a reduction of dates and garum. You can feel your own brain trying to back out of this decision, but you're committed now. You lift a spoonful of the shimmering greyish matter and take a bite. It's smooth, almost custard-like, and shockingly rich. The sauce is sweet and spicy, masking the iron tang that lurks just under the surface. You chew slowly, thoughtfully, the way someone does when they're trying to make sense of their life choices. The table applauds, not for you, but for the dish. Apparently, this was the first time the cook attempted a six-brain blend: parrot, peacock, thrush, flamingo, pigeon and goose. A true avian symphony, as your host proclaims. Bird brains, especially from peacocks and parrots, were considered the height of culinary refinement among Rome's upper crust. These weren't everyday meals, these were statement dishes, complex, labour-intensive and exclusive to those who could afford the luxury of sacrificing 6 different talking or singing birds just to make a pâté. While most Romans stuck with simple poultry or avoided birds altogether, the elite gorged on their heads. Why? Because it proved they could. And in Rome, the ability to waste extravagantly was just another flex. Parrot livers come next, sautéed and served on tiny spoons made of glass. The flavour is intense, sharp with vinegar and mustard seed, and the texture's somewhere between foie gras and wet chalk. You swallow and smile weakly. Someone jokes that the parrot might have cursed them before it died. You chuckle nervously. No one else laughs. Historically, peacock meat wasn't all that tasty. The real appeal was the show, the way a cooked bird could be redressed in its own plumage and posed like a statue of edible grandeur. Pliny the Elder, him again, mentions that peacocks were among the most expensive birds at Roman markets, prized not for flavour, but for the sheer vanity of serving one. Brains, however, were another story. Tiny, laborious to extract, yet viewed as an aphrodisiac and believed to boost intellect. Because obviously eating the brain of a creature with a pea-sized memory and a flair for screeching was going to make you smarter. The lore goes deeper. In some elite circles it was said that peacock brains could ward off melancholy or madness. Others believed they had prophetic qualities if consumed during certain festivals. Fringe? Definitely. But it didn't stop some emperors, rumoured, never confirmed, from ordering brain stews as part of their late-night banquets. The medical community of the time, deeply divided. Some physicians endorsed it. Others warned that excessive consumption of bird brains could weaken the nerves and cause strange dreams. You silently wonder what the dreams of someone who's eaten 6 birds' brains at once might look like. Feathery, probably, and judgmental. There's also a practical debate among modern scholars. Some argue that these dishes were extremely rare, possibly exaggerated by satirists or philosophers trying to show how ridiculous the wealthy had become. Others point to surviving recipes and refuse heaps full of tiny skull fragments, as evidence that bird brains, however gruesome, were actually consumed. Still, even among the eccentric elite, this wasn't lunch, it was ritual. A culinary poem to vanity. As the meal rolls on, you're served a small roasted lark, split open with its minuscule brain delicately exposed. It's decorative more than anything, and you suspect it might be raw. The host beams as you pick at it. The gods, he says with a reverent tone, gave us the whole animal. It's impolite to ignore the clever parts. You nod slowly, trying not to imagine what he serves to guests he doesn't like. The meal ends with candied rose petals and small cakes shaped like birds in flight. Symbolic, perhaps, or ironic. You're too full to care. As you rise to leave, the host places a single peacock feather into your hand. To remember what you ate, he says with a wink. The feather catches the light, a dazzling shimmer of blues and greens. It's beautiful, unsettling, and definitely smells faintly of vinegar. You step outside into the crisp Roman afternoon, the sky a pale stretch of blue over marble rooftops and flapping laundry. Birds chirp in a nearby fig tree, completely unaware that their cousins have been reduced to brain butter and liver hors d'oeuvres. You walk a little faster than usual. You're back in the city's quieter northern quarter now, your brain still trying to forget the consistency of peacock cortex when you're summoned to a villa known for its wine collection. That seems safe. A nice vineyard stroll, maybe a gentle lesson on Roman viticulture. Your stomach dares to hope. But of course, nothing in ancient Rome is ever just what it sounds like. You arrive to find the courtyard table already set, not with bread and cheese, but with goblets of wine so dark they look more like syrup than anything drinkable. Beside each goblet is a small dish of what appears to be crumbling white powder. Sugar of Saturn, your host says with a theatrical bow, gesturing to the powder like it's treasure. You freeze mid-step, you've heard of this. It's not sugar, it's lead. More specifically, it's lead acetate, a sweet-tasting compound Romans used to balance out overly acidic or bitter wines. The practice was common enough that entire treatises were written on how to make poor-quality wine more palatable by boiling grape juice in lead pots, allowing it to absorb the metal's sweetness. It worked, technically, but at a cost that wouldn't become fully understood for centuries. You stare into your goblet, now seeing it less as a beverage and more like poison with a charming colour. But you drink it anyway, because that's the job now. It's surprisingly smooth, warm with undertones of figs and cloves. You see the appeal immediately, it's dangerously good. Your host, a self-proclaimed wine philosopher who seems permanently 3 sips away from tears or laughter, passes you another cup. This one is even sweeter, almost floral. That, he declares, was boiled in lead kettles for a full day, just the way Apicius liked it. You nod slowly, unsure whether to be impressed or alarmed. Historically, this wasn't fringe. Lead was a feature of Roman culinary life. It lined pipes, coated pots, and made regular appearances in cooking and preserving. The very term sapper, a reduced grape syrup, was often produced by boiling down must in lead vessels. The result? A thick, sweet concentrate that was added to everything from sauces to desserts. Scholars now know that this process leached lead directly into the mixture, so when you hear that elite Romans enjoyed wine flavoured with sapper, you can mentally replace that with wine flavoured with delicious slow death. There's a fringe theory that the widespread use of lead additives contributed to the neurological decline of Rome's upper class, poisoning their minds, dulling their senses and slowly unravelling the empire from within. It's dramatic, certainly, and modern scholars are split. Some argue that the amount of lead ingested through wine was minimal and inconsistent. Others say that prolonged low-level exposure combined with lead-lined aqueducts and pipes created a society quietly pickling itself in heavy metal. You sip again, partly out of morbid curiosity. A servant brings out a dish of pears poached in the same syrupy wine. They shimmer with a deep garnet hue, sliced into perfect half-moons, then drizzled with more sapper and sprinkled with herbs. You take a bite. The sweetness is overwhelming, cloying, rich, and strangely chemical. It coats your tongue like honey made from battery acid. Delicious, in a dangerous way. You feel like you're eating a crime scene, and it tastes incredible. Your host explains that this wine, the kind made in lead kettles, was a sign of refinement. Guests knew they were drinking something rich, sophisticated, labour-intensive. No one worried about trace metals, no one ran tests. If it tasted sweet and left your tongue a little numb, that just meant it was working. Some even believed sapper had health benefits, good for digestion, better than plain honey, and useful for masking the bitterness of less than fresh ingredients. If you feel your tongue tingling now, it's probably just tradition. Here's your historical curveball for the day. While the upper classes bathed their palates in leaded wine, Some Roman physicians, yes, actual doctors, were beginning to suspect something was off. Writings from as early as the 1st century CE mentioned symptoms associated with what we'd now call lead poisoning: abdominal pain, fatigue, irritability, even madness. But because there was no concept of toxicity in the modern sense, and because these symptoms overlapped with so many other imbalances of the humours, the warnings were usually ignored. After all, who wants to blame their favourite dessert wine for a bad mood? You look around the courtyard where guests recline, laughing and sipping from goblets, probably laced with enough lead to plate a chariot. No one seems concerned. One woman swirls her wine and comments on its heavy body, unaware of how literal that compliment might be. Another man dips his figs into the sapper like it's chocolate sauce, then washes it down with more of the same. And in a way, you get it. The Romans didn't see food and drink as purely functional. They were symbols of status, of sophistication, of domination over nature. If the process required boiling grape juice in poison, so be it. Sweetness was worth the price. And anyway, if something made you feel a little lightheaded, that just meant it was good. As the sun sets over the villa's tiled roof, you sit back and sip one last cup of this treacherous vintage. The sweetness lingers on your tongue, metallic and lush, like something forbidden. You think of emperors sipping this same blend, of patricians toasting victories while slowly numbing their minds. You wonder how many decisions in Roman history were made while slightly lead drunk. Probably too many. The evening ends with candied quinces, also soaked in sapa. You chew thoughtfully, letting the flavours flood your mouth, knowing full well this might shave a few years off your hypothetical Roman lifespan. But honestly, after peacock brains and pickled jellyfish, a little lead wine feels almost quaint. You walk home under a darkening sky, the wine warming your gut and your nerves tingling just enough to remind you. In ancient Rome, danger didn't always arrive with a dagger. Sometimes it came in a goblet, sweet, shimmering, and perfectly poisoned. You're standing knee-deep in seawater, sandals abandoned on the shore, robes hiked up like a child afraid of puddles, and you're watching a man pull sea urchins out of the shallows with the casual precision of someone who's done this since he could crawl. The waves lap around you, warm and salty, and the smell of the Mediterranean rolls in thick and briny. You've come to visit a Roman piscina, a kind of ancient fish farm built into the coastline, part luxury hobby, part sustainable seafood source, and of course, yet another flex for the elite. The man introduces himself as Lucius, a steward of a seaside estate that belongs to a senator who's far too busy attending philosophical banquets in the city to visit his own fish. You learn that this structure, built from stone and fitted with iron grates to allow the flow of seawater, houses a variety of marine delicacies: mullet, oysters, mussels, purple-shelled clams, and, most fascinating of all, live sea urchins that cling to the crevices like spiny gemstones. Some are pale and bland, others a deep blackish purple, their spikes moving slowly like eyelashes underwater. You're both repelled and mesmerised. Lucius cracks open an urchin with a small stone, prying it open with practised ease to reveal its bright orange roe. He spoons some out with a piece of flatbread and offers it to you without a word. You hesitate, but really at this point, what's one more ocean oddity between friends? You eat it. It's cold, silky, and impossibly rich, like swallowing the ocean's own butter. It tastes of salt and minerals, brine and something faintly sweet, almost like sea-scented custard. It's not like anything else you've eaten. It's not pretending to be. This is the ocean's most unapologetic morsel, eaten raw, fresh from the shell, right there on the shore. Sea urchins were, in some corners of Roman culinary tradition, the height of delicacy, especially among those who lived on the coast and had access to fresh, live specimens. Apicius himself offers several recipes involving urchins, including one where they're boiled gently, their roe removed, and then mixed into sauces for other seafood dishes. But for the real connoisseurs, raw was the way to go. A good urchin, pulled fresh from the water, required nothing more than a splash of vinegar, or, if you were fancy, a drop of imported honey wine. You wade farther along the edge of the piscina and find a servant harvesting clams, spondylus to be specific. These were no ordinary clams. With their radiant purple shells, they were both culinary treasures and luxury items. The dye extracted from them was used in clothing for the ultra-rich, and the shells were polished and sold as jewellery or game tokens. But you're here for their flesh. The clams are steamed in seawater and wine, then topped with a sauce of garlic, parsley and, you guessed it, garum. The meat is plump and springy with a sweetness that balances the salt. You chew slowly, looking out across the water, watching the sun flash off the mosaic-like surface of the sea. You can almost understand the obsession. Here's a quirky historical note. Roman fish farms weren't just for feeding guests. They were expressions of status and control. The ability to bend nature, to keep fish alive until the exact moment they were needed, was a kind of aristocratic sorcery. Emperors and senators built lavish piscinae with terracotta piping, aqueduct-fed basins, and even inlaid mosaics at the bottom so the fish could swim over art. Lucullus, that famously over-the-top gourmand, once spent more money on his fish ponds than on his entire villa. He was mocked for it, until guests saw the size of his oysters. Then everyone wanted one. Still, not everyone agreed on the value of these seaside larders. Some Roman moralists sneered at the luxury, seeing it as another example of indulgence gone mad. Cicero once roasted a political rival in a letter for spending more on mullets than on military defence. Others argued that the fish tasted worse than wild-caught specimens, fattier, lazier, like livestock without ambition. But for the Roman elite, the point wasn't flavour, it was convenience, showmanship. You didn't just eat an oyster, you summoned it, live, from your personal sea kingdom. Back on the rocky shore, Lucius brings out the last offering of the day, a small flat cake made with minced fish liver and sea urchin roe, baked in clay over coals. It smells pungent, almost aggressive, but you take a bite out of sheer curiosity. The taste is bold, umami to the point of belligerence, but not without charm. You can see how someone would crave it, in small, dangerous doses, and then, because this is Rome, the steward pulls out a jug of wine diluted with salt water. It's an acquired taste. You sip it because your dignity is now entirely optional. The briny liquid coats your throat, mixing with the lingering taste of urchin and clam. You feel like a trident-wielding sea god and a slightly poisoned beachcomber at the same time. As the sun sinks low, casting long shadows over the stone basin, and the water gently laps against the walls, you start to understand the strange beauty of this place. It's not just about food, it's about dominion. The Romans didn't just want to eat the sea, they wanted to own it, train it, and have it ready on command. You climb back up the slope toward the villa, your skin salty, your breath a blend of shellfish and seawater, and your heart a little lighter. There's something powerful about eating with your toes in the waves, something ancient, something Roman. By now you've learned that every Roman meal is an act of calculated risk. But today's experience adds a new layer. The possibility that someone at the table might want you dead. You're in the villa of a wealthy official, exactly the sort of man who speaks softly, smiles constantly, and surrounds himself with people who never sit too close to his wine. The triclinium is lavish, as always. Silk drapes, bronze candelabras, and a low table groaning under the weight of olives, sausages, grilled songbirds, and one large domed dish no one is touching yet. But what catches your eye isn't the food, it's the man seated quietly near the host, eyes scanning every plate, every cup, every gesture. This is the pregustator, the imperial food taster. You watch as he reaches for the dish in front of him, lifts the lid, and scoops out a portion of something soft and golden. It's a stew of lamb brains and lentils, topped with coriander, dried rose petals, and a drizzle of fish sauce. He eats it slowly with the grim solemnity of a man who may not be around for dessert. Everyone waits. There's silence. No one else touches the food. He chews, he swallows, he breathes. Only then does the host gesture for the rest of you to begin. In ancient Rome, poisoning wasn't just a fear, it was practically a sport. Especially among the upper class, where inheritance lines, political rivalries, and grudges fermented faster than the garum. Having a food taster was as necessary as having a good cook, and in some elite circles just as prestigious. These men, or sometimes women, were trained to detect bitterness, odd textures, or any symptom of foul play, often relying more on instinct than any kind of scientific method. Of course, that made for short careers, or at least very cautious meals. Your host notices your fascination and leans in. We change tasters every few months, he whispers. Not because we need to, just so no one gets too comfortable. He sips his wine slowly, as if daring someone to be the last one drinking. You do your best not to follow suit too quickly. Today's spread is luxurious, with each dish given a cautious nod by the taster before it reaches your plate. There's salted mackerel with honey-glazed turnips, barley cakes with smoked eel, and slices of rabbit liver soaked in pomegranate wine. Everything is decadent, everything is slightly suspect. At one point, the taster pauses over a bowl of fig-stuffed mussels and lifts his nose like a bloodhound. After a moment, he waves it through. You notice 3 guests quietly choose something else anyway. Here's your quirky fact for the evening. Some Roman hosts were so paranoid that they made their tasters eat not just the first bite, but every 3rd or 4th bite as well, in case the poison had a delayed release or was hidden deeper in the dish. Others used animals, dogs, birds or monkeys as test subjects. If the parrot drops dead mid-biscuit, maybe you don't finish your dinner. The most paranoid, they only ate fruit from their personal orchards, drank rainwater collected from silver dishes, and had entire kitchens sealed and guarded by eunuchs. The most infamous poisonings in Roman history read like grim theatre. Claudius allegedly fell victim to a poisoned plate of mushrooms. Germanicus may have been fed a lethal cocktail of cursed food and dark magic. And Agrippina, Nero's mother, reportedly built a dining room with a collapsing ceiling just in case poison didn't get the job done. You don't just murder in Rome, you choreograph it. Naturally, the role of food taster comes with debate. Some historians argue it was mostly ceremonial, psychological comfort for jittery nobles. After all, if you wait to see if someone else keels over before you eat, you're going to be waiting a long time. Others suggest that these tasters were intimately involved with the kitchen staff and trained to recognise tampering. An unfamiliar cook, an odd substitution, a smudge of powder on the edge of a bowl. In high-risk households, the taster was the most important person at the table, and sometimes the most expendable. You watch this one work. He's good, calm, alert, with a subtle nod after every dish, like a priest offering absolution. But you can see the fatigue in his eyes, the little flinch when the roasted figs arrive in a sauce he doesn't recognise. He hesitates, tastes, swallows, and waits, always waiting. The meal moves on. The host begins telling a story about a rival who tragically passed away after an ill-timed snack of wild mushrooms. Everyone laughs, too loudly. You notice that one of the guests, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers, hasn't touched his food at all. He claims he's fasting, or has a delicate stomach, or is simply not fond of figs. No one believes him. But no one calls him out either. Rome is a city where suspicion passes for manners. Here's the scholarly debate to chew on. How often did this happen, really? Were poisonings rampant or just a juicy topic for Roman tabloids and political propaganda? Some argue that actual poisonings were rare, exaggerated by paranoid elites and scandal-loving historians. Others say the lack of surviving evidence only proves how good the poisoners were. After all, if it looks like a natural death, who's going to question a spoiled fig? As the final course is served, cheese sweetened with pine honey and perfumed with thyme, the food taster stares at it for a full 5 seconds before giving a slow, wary nod. You bite into yours, and it's glorious. Creamy, herbaceous, not at all deadly. Probably. The meal ends with a toast, everyone raises their goblets, and for a long moment, no one drinks. Then the host sips, then the taster, then everyone else. You walk home under moonlight, stomach full and nerves buzzing. You're not sure whether it was the wine or the lingering tension, but your fingers tremble just a little. You've learned that in ancient Rome, survival isn't just about what you eat, but who eats it first. You'd think that after everything, flamingo tongues, eel funerals, and jellyfish in questionable sauces, you'd be numb to shock. But this time, the moment you enter the thermopolium, a Roman version of a fast food counter, your eyes land on something that resets your entire sense of edible boundaries. There, behind a glassless wooden stall, nestled between bowls of olives and skewered sausages, is a tray of what can only be described as meatballs. Except instead of being shaped like the usual savoury spheres of minced lamb or pork, these particular delicacies are arranged in unsettling anatomical pairs. You're told they're testicles, not metaphorically, not euphemistically, literally. The cojones of a goat, to be precise, and not just boiled and served, but roasted and placed atop slices of toasted bread drizzled with honey and dusted with cracked peppercorns. You stare at them, trying not to let your face twitch. The vendor grins and offers you a fresh one, balancing the oddly plump cut on a square of crusty black bread, as if he's proud of having nailed the presentation. You take it. Of course you do. The first bite is confusing. It's soft, much softer than you expected, almost custard-like inside, but the char on the outer layer adds a crackle that plays a cruel game with your jaw. The sweetness from the honey is deliberate, you're told, to mask any lingering bitterness in the organ. Best served warm, the vendor notes. Cold ones get rubbery. You chew slowly, careful not to look too thoughtful. Around you, customers, workers, tradesmen, and a few young scholars with sandals worn thin devour their toasty testicle sandwiches like it's the Roman equivalent of grabbing a breakfast burrito. For them, this isn't extreme, it's protein, it's texture, it's Tuesday. In Roman cuisine, the consumption of animal testicles wasn't considered taboo, it was respected. In fact, offal in general, organs, extremities, innards, was viewed as both economical and in some cases powerful. Goat or bull testicles in particular were associated with strength and virility. Eating them was believed to boost a man's stamina, fertility, and occasionally courage. If you were preparing for battle, or trying to impress a lover, or simply nursing a midlife crisis Roman style, this might be your lunch of choice. You hear stories from locals. One man tells you that wrestlers in the ludi, gladiator schools, often consumed cooked testicles the night before a fight. Another insists that combining them with vinegar and crushed mint leaves helped with the humours, which honestly seems like a generous description of what you just swallowed. Here's your quirky corner of Roman food history. Testicles weren't always consumed cooked. There were raw preparations too, sliced thin and cured with salt, then dipped in olive oil like some horrifying carpaccio. According to one physician's manual, this was particularly good for those who lack fire in their veins. That's not food advice. That's a Roman insult hiding inside a medical prescription. And yet, despite its popularity among certain social classes, testicle consumption was also mocked by Roman satirists. Juvenal, ever the killjoy, wrote bitterly about elites who bragged about the virility of their food while doing absolutely nothing of value. One poetic fragment even describes a banquet where a man eats so many roasted animal parts, he begins to believe he's transforming into a goat. Whether that's a culinary critique or a mythological metaphor, no one's entirely sure. Scholars still argue about just how widespread this dish was. Some say it was confined to the fringes of tavern life and gladiator camps. Others suggest it was a normalised part of Roman street food culture, no more strange than grilled sausage or fried fish. The lack of clear documentation means we're often left interpreting fragments, recipes without context, graffiti with questionable spelling, or a single line in a play where someone jokes about eating ambition on toast. Could that be a metaphor for testicles? Honestly, in Rome, probably. You try a second bite. It's not worse than the first, but your mind can't stop replaying the anatomical truth of what you're chewing. The texture, the way the honey soaks into the toast, the lingering note of gaminess. It's all too vivid. And yet, you finish it. You've crossed the line. You're now someone who can casually say, "I've eaten testicles on toast," and mean it literally. Afterward, you walk through the marketplace in a daze. Your stomach doesn't hurt, but it does feel aware. You pass by spice vendors, fishmongers, stalls selling pickled livers and honeyed crickets, but nothing grabs your attention quite the way that tray of roasted reproductive courage did. You wonder how many Roman soldiers walked into battle with that exact same sandwich, rolling around in their gut. By midday, the city grows louder, and you find a fountain to sit by and reflect on your evolving relationship with Roman food. What once repulsed now intrigues. What once seemed bizarre now feels, if not normal, at least explainable. The Romans didn't flinch from biology. They didn't hide the truth behind flour or pastry or plating. They embraced the animal, every inch of it, and then added honey. You sip from a water skin, letting the clean, cold taste cut through the memory of your last meal. It doesn't help much. Toasted goat testicle, you realise, is a flavour that doesn't go quietly. You stand, adjust your robe, and head off toward your next meal, whatever nightmare or masterpiece it may be. In Rome, you don't ask what you're eating until it's already in your mouth. You walk into a dinner party where the smell hits before you even cross the threshold. A complex layering of charred wood, roasted meat, herbs, and Ash. Actual ash. The kind that clings to the back of your throat and makes you question whether something's been burnt on purpose or just left unattended for too long. But this is no accident. Tonight's meal isn't just a dinner, it's a performance. You're in the home of a wealthy Roman patron known not for his wealth or taste, but for what he calls culinary theatre. That phrase alone makes your stomach coil slightly, but you've come this far. You square your shoulders and step into the flames, figuratively for now. The triclinium is transformed into a stage. Thick drapery muffles the outside noise, and flickering oil lamps cast everything in amber and gold. At the centre of the room sits an enormous brazier filled with slow-burning oak and bay laurel. Its smoke snakes through the air, giving the room a smell that's half sacred, half barbecue. Slaves in dark tunics move silently between guests, laying out plates made of volcanic stone, their edges etched with scenes of Bacchus's drunken revels. The first course is placed before you, a miniature lamb moulded out of spiced barley mash, covered in a thin layer of charred dough. When sliced, it bleeds beet juice. The host claps his hands delightedly as guests murmur and applaud. "A sacrifice to appetite," he declares. Someone giggles. You try to remember if you've eaten yet or just watched art die on a plate. Then comes a dish you can't quite identify, wrapped in blackened fig leaves and cooked directly in hot ash. You're told it's pigeon, stuffed with pine nuts, garlic, and mashed raisins, then pressed beneath a burning tile until its skin crisps and its juices caramelize. You open the leaf carefully and take a bite. It's smoky, tender, slightly sweet, and unexpectedly wonderful. The ash adds a flavour you'd call primitive, if it didn't taste so sophisticated. Your fingers are smudged grey now, and your wine tastes sharper by contrast. You feel yourself slipping into the performance. Ash and charcoal were surprisingly common in Roman cooking, not just by accident, but as a deliberate technique. Chefs would bury meats and tubers in ash to cook them slowly and evenly, often combining this method with spices and glazes that made the most of the smoky undertones. You're served a skewer of boar glazed with honey and black pepper, rolled in powdered olive pit ash to give it a volcanic crust, as the cook boasts. It crunches like black sand but gives way to perfectly cooked meat. You chew slowly, watching others try not to lick their fingers. Here's your oddball historical fact. Some Roman kitchens kept bowls of clean sifted ash, not for cooking, but for serving. Ash acted as a natural insulator and moisture absorber. Delicate desserts like cheesecakes or moulded honey custards were sometimes cooled by being placed in ash beds, allowing them to firm up gently without overcooking. It's not pretty, but it's effective. One guest jokes that he once found a beetle in his custard and didn't even complain because the flavour was divine. You try not to overthink that. As the night deepens, the dishes get weirder. There's a clay-sealed duck that must be broken open with a small hammer, releasing a puff of rosemary smoke. There's a salad of bitter greens and grilled onions, served in a bowl of cooled charcoal so your fingers smell like a campfire for the rest of the night. There's a dessert, some kind of honey pudding served inside a charred pomegranate shell, with the seed stained black from soot. You eat it anyway, and then another. You're not even hungry anymore, you're just curious. The host stands to deliver a toast, quoting from memory something about Prometheus and the fire stolen from the gods. He declares his table to be the altar of culinary truth. You raise your cup because everyone else does. He smiles at you and says, "It's not just about taste, is it?" And you realise he's not asking, he's telling. There's an open scholarly question about how widespread this kind of culinary performance really was. Some believe only the wealthiest Romans indulged in these edible spectacles, and even then, only during festivals or special banquets. Others argue that showmanship was a key ingredient in all Roman dining, from taverns to tricliniums. What better way to prove your intellect, taste and cultural savvy than by turning dinner into a conversation piece? You look around and see a woman carefully dusting off her slice of ash-cooked eggplant before eating it. Another guest smearing duck fat across blackened bread with practiced flair. Everyone here is acting to some degree, playing a role in the performance. Even the food taster hovering near the entrance seems slightly theatrical. Tonight, sniffing each dish like a priest preparing to bless it. The final act is absurd in its simplicity. Boiled eggs, served whole, their shells cracked and streaked with ash. You peel yours carefully, revealing an interior tinged slightly grey from the smoke. The yolk is firm, the flavour rich and earthy. It tastes like survival and luxury in the same bite. The host watches you eat and nods approvingly. "You understand," he says. As you leave the villa, your robes dusted with ash, your hands stained with oil and smoke, you feel like you've stepped out of a myth. Not just fed, but initiated. You've participated in a rite, where food isn't just nourishment, it's narrative. Burned, buried, broken open, and shared. And tomorrow, when you brush soot from your sleeves and smell rosemary in your hair, you'll remember the lesson. In ancient Rome, even the ashes had flavour. You wake up in a neighbourhood the Romans would politely call modest, which is their way of saying dirt between the mosaics. The kind of place where no one's feasting on peacock brains or sculpting duck pâté into marble swans. No fountains, no ash theatrics. Just people doing what they've done for centuries. Working, sweating, and eating what they can afford, which today means bread. Lots of it. But not the golden, sesame-dusted loaves from noble ovens. Number your hair for the kind of bread that breaks before it bends. The kind that doubles as a weapon or possibly a roofing tile. Welcome to the world of Roman peasant bread. Black, dense, and nearly indestructible. The pistrina, or bakery, is a hot, dusty place that smells like yeast, charcoal, and overworked labourers. A mule turns a grinding wheel in the corner, its blindfold frayed, its patience thinner than your sense of self-preservation. Flour coats every surface like volcanic ash. You're handed a small circular loaf the size of a saucer. It's warm, slightly cracked on top, and so dense it could stop a javelin. You tap it against the stone counter. It makes a sound. Not a soft thud, but a clink. You raise an eyebrow. The baker shrugs. "This is panis niger," he tells you. Black bread. Made with barley, sometimes millet, occasionally chestnut flour if you're lucky. And by black, he doesn't mean richly browned. He means greyish, gritty, and veined with bits of chaff and unground grain that scratch your teeth like sandpaper on marble. You break off a piece. It doesn't tear, it fractures. The taste is honest, earthy, a little sour thanks to the wild fermentation. The crust is tough, the interior slightly chewy, and the whole experience is like biting into a brick someone had strong opinions about. But it fills your belly. It stays with you. And in a world where lunch might be the only meal of the day, that matters more than flavour. This bread was the backbone of the Roman working class. For slaves, soldiers, labourers, and the perpetually underpaid, panis niger was cheap, filling and storable. It could be made in bulk, dried out and eaten days later, soaked in wine or water, or chewed raw if your teeth could handle it. Archaeological finds from Pompeii show carbonised loaves of this stuff, preserved mid-bake by Vesuvius like little culinary fossils. Some still bear the baker's stamp. You imagine handing your loaf back. "Yes, hi, this shattered my molars. Do you do refunds?" The baker shows you a trick, cutting the bread into chunks and simmering it in water with a few herbs, olive oil if there's any left, and whatever scraps of vegetable happen to be lying around. The result is a sort of soup, thickened by the crumbling bread. It's not glamorous, but it's warm, and it works. He calls it pulse panis, literally bread mush. He doesn't say it proudly, but there's affection in the way he stirs it. Here's your quirky historical detail. Some Roman bakers mixed terra sigillata, a medicinal clay, into their flour, believing it helped purify the bread, or even gave it health benefits. Scholars debate whether this actually helped, or just added more dirt to an already gritty situation. In at least one surviving text, a satirical character complains that he chipped his tooth not on a bone, but on the bread itself. You suspect it wasn't a joke. And here's where it gets scholarly. There's long-standing debate about whether poor Romans really ate this bread by choice or necessity. Some argue that barley bread, while coarse, had more fibre and nutrients than refined white loaves, and might have even been healthier. Others point out that no one voluntarily eats sand-filled crust unless it's the only option. The appearance of these loaves in poorer homes, military camps and workhouses suggests it was survival food, not artisan fare. Still, there's an undeniable dignity to it. Bread was a symbol of Roman identity, so much so that the empire's most basic political bribe was bread and circuses. The annona, or state grain dole, ensured that even the poorest citizens in Rome received a ration of grain to make their own bread. It wasn't generosity, it was insurance against riots. A hungry crowd starts fires, a fed crowd just heckles. Back in the bakery, the next batch of loaves is coming out of the oven. dusted with what might be flour or masonry debris. You're not sure anymore. The baker gives you a wrapped bundle and says it'll keep for 3 days. 4, if you pretend it's toast. You thank him. Your arms now weighted with what might be the world's first edible paperweights. Later you sit on the edge of a fountain and nibble your bread with a piece of dried cheese. It's hard, it's dry, but it's satisfying in a way that makes you feel connected to something ancient, gritty, and real. This is the kind of food you can trust. Not because it's tasty, but because it makes no promises. It simply exists, just like the people who eat it. As you finish the last bite, Olgyan, the child, runs past you carrying a loaf like it's a discus. A woman nearby dips hers in watered-down wine and chews methodically, eyes half closed. A soldier sharpens his blade with one hand and tears off a piece of bread with the other. No fanfare, no complaints, just life and the bread that keeps it going. You dust the crumbs from your lap, your jaw a little sore but your stomach full. In a city built on extravagance and illusion, it's strangely comforting to know that some things, like bread that could double as a roofing tile, never pretended to be anything they're not. You're wandering through the Forum Boreum, the old cattle market, early in the evening, when the crowds thin out and the stalls start closing. You've had enough of the usual fare for one lifetime. Your jaw still aches from yesterday's black bread, and your stomach hasn't forgiven you for the goat testicle toast. So tonight you're aiming for something simple, something gentle. A nice fig, maybe, that's all, just a fig. And then you hear someone whisper, "You looking for the Silenus fruit?" That stops you in your tracks. You turn to see a man with a sun-leathered face, and eyes like he hasn't slept since Julius Caesar's second divorce. He stands beside a cart of ordinary-looking figs, brown, slightly wrinkled, glistening with just enough syrup to catch the torchlight. "They're sweet," he says, but not just sweet. He winks, which should be illegal in this part of the city. They make you dream, deep dreams, prophetic dreams. You raise an eyebrow. He lifts one fig between thumb and forefinger and sets it gently in your palm. "Silenus dreams," he says. "You'll see." You're not sure if he's selling fruit or a psychological crisis. The name Silenus fruit is whispered in certain corners of Rome. Scholars mostly dismiss it as folklore, a marketplace myth designed to move bruised produce to gullible philosophers. But the legend lingers. According to rumour, certain figs, grown near temples to Bacchus, or fertilised with special compost, and by special, we mean spiked with fermented goat dung and possibly narcotic herbs, induce vivid, often prophetic dreams. Some say the figs are soaked in a wine infused with poppy resin. Others claim it's henbane. One theory even suggests the figs grow near burial grounds, absorbing strange powers from the restless dead. You bite into the fig. It's ripe, almost sinfully so, the skin splitting under your teeth with a burst of syrupy sweetness. For a moment, nothing happens. Then a heat creeps up your neck. Not unpleasant, but definitely unnatural. Your limbs feel lighter, your eyes a bit fuzzy, and then the world shifts. You're still sitting in the forum, but the torches seem to pulse with light. The shadows stretch longer. A vendor across the way is melting like wax. You blink and see a lion wearing a toga. You're either hallucinating or someone has finally weaponized produce. In ancient Rome, the line between food and medicine was razor thin and often crossed. Certain fruits, herbs, and wines were dosed with natural narcotics, used not only for pain relief but also for spiritual purposes. Figs, with their heavy sweetness and mythological ties to fertility and divine favour, were often at the centre of strange beliefs. Combine that with the Roman appetite for mystical experiences and recreational experimentation, and you get something like the Silenus fruit, a snack that may, or may not, show you the future. Silenus himself, in myth, was a drunken satyr known for falling into trances and uttering cryptic truths. He was often depicted with eyes rolled back, mouth half open, mumbling divine nonsense into a cup of wine. He's the kind of character who probably would have eaten a prophetic fig and then gotten into a fistfight with a goat. The fruit, by association, took on his name. You stumble through the marketplace, visions flickering at the edges of your sight. Shapes and voices swirl. At one point you think you see your reflection in a bronze shield, but your face is different. Older, or maybe younger, or maybe not yours at all. The effect is disorienting, but not entirely unpleasant. You feel lifted, loosened. like someone shook the map of your mind and let all the pieces fall somewhere new. Here's your quirky historical gem. It wasn't just figs that carried mystical baggage in Rome. Lettuce, of all things, was believed to dull sexual desire. Mint could inflame it. Basil was sometimes rubbed on the temples to provoke visions, and poppies, of course, were the crown jewel of Roman narcobotany, used in everything from sleep aids to lethal poisons. The idea of a fruit that could open your mind to divine whispers wasn't just fantasy. It was part of a larger culinary mysticism, blending the spiritual with the sensory. But modern scholars remain skeptical. Was the Silenus fig real? Or was it a story? An ancient meme passed from street hawker to gullible tourist? Some believe it was a joke, a metaphor for the dreamy sweetness of overripe figs during harvest season. Others argue that certain fig varieties, when fermented or combined with natural alkaloids, could have mild psychoactive effects. Without written recipes or botanical remains, we're left piecing together legends with a fork and wishful thinking. You finally find a bench, slumping down with the last bite of fig still melting on your tongue. A dog stares at you like it knows too much. The moon pulses slightly. You're vaguely aware of someone singing nearby in a language you've never heard. Or maybe it's Latin, and your ears have just turned to clay. After what feels like hours, or maybe minutes, you blink hard, and the world rights itself. The shadows shrink back to their proper size. The torches stop breathing. The dog is gone. You feel grounded again, but not quite the same, like your thoughts have been rearranged by something older than reason. You stand and look back at the fig vendor's stall. It's empty now. The figs are gone. No sign of the man. Just a sticky spot on the stone and a faint scent of honey and smoke. You're not entirely sure it happened. You're also not entirely sure it didn't. You make your way home slowly, your feet finding the cobbles as if they've walked this path 1,000 times. In your satchel, one last fig remains. You don't touch it, not tonight, maybe not ever. Some fruits are best left for when you're ready to ask the questions you're not sure you want answers to. It's the kind of dinner party where the wine flows faster than the conversation, and no one's really here to eat. You can tell the moment you step through the door. The host is reclining on a couch carved from an imported marble, wearing sandals more expensive than most people's homes, and a tunic embroidered with a scene so detailed it probably has its own backstory. Guests lounge around him like decadent furniture. Philosophers, failed poets, merchants with suspiciously well-fed bellies, all murmuring in practiced tones about art, politics, and who's secretly sleeping with whom. A golden platter of figs sits untouched. You know what kind of night this is. You've wandered into a literary banquet, and by literary you mean completely unhinged. These kinds of feasts aren't about food in the traditional sense. They're about performance, satire, absurdity. You're here because someone invited you with a wink and a whisper that tonight's dinner will be educational. The host claps his hands and a row of servants enters with trays bearing dishes that are too ornate to eat and too strange to ignore. The first is a fish moulded out of cheese. It flops when poked, oozes something yellow, and smells like it's halfway through a theological crisis. Is it edible? Someone asks. The host just shrugs. Define edible. You laugh because everyone else does, and take a cautious bite. It's goat cheese whipped with vinegar, honey, and mashed anchovies, shaped by someone with a disturbing amount of time and a soft spot for chaos. The flavour is bright, salty, and sharp enough to make your molars hum. You eat another bite anyway. You're part of the play now. This kind of feast was immortalised in works like the Satyricon, where the banquet of Trimalchio, a cartoonishly rich freedman, descends into culinary madness. Picture courses shaped like the zodiac, food dyed to match the seasons, entire boars brought in stuffed with live birds and coins, all served with a side of poetic posturing and drunken arguments about metaphysics. These events weren't real. Probably. Or maybe they were. Roman satire had a way of blurring the line between parody and painful truth. Tonight's host is channeling that spirit with alarming commitment. A servant presents a roasted lamb with horns made of pastry, and legs carved from dyed radish. Another arrives carrying a roasted dormouse curled up on a grape leaf, holding what appears to be a tiny fork carved from sugar. You can't make this up, but someone clearly did. Here's your quirky fact for the evening. Some Roman satirical banquets included foods designed to insult the guests. Bitter herbs served with overly sweet sauces, boiled leeks presented as luxury fare, even spoiled fish dressed in gold leaf to mock an elite's inability to recognise quality. One known recipe involves a loaf of bread filled with rocks, a not-so-subtle jab at guests who showed up only for free food. You glance down at your cup of wine, wondering if it's been laced with metaphor. At one point, a musician enters, playing a lyre and singing a tragic poem about a turnip that falls in love with a carrot and is then boiled alive in a stew of unrequited love. No one interrupts. A few people tear up. The host claps, delighted. Poetry and root vegetables, he says, the backbone of civilization. Next comes what the host calls dinner's punchline, a dessert that looks like a pile of dung, and somehow tastes like heaven. It's spiced date paste rolled in black sesame, honey and crushed almonds, shaped by a chef with an unfortunate sense of humour and incredible talent. You eat it without hesitation, because why not? It's the best thing you've had all night. Now, the scholarly debate. Did these banquets ever really happen? Or were they just literary exaggerations? A way for satirists to poke fun at the nouveau riche, at freedmen trying to buy status, at the moral decay of Rome one stuffed eel at a time. Some scholars argue that satirical banquets were pure fiction, caricatures of overconsumption. Others point to archaeological finds, dining rooms decorated with zodiac mosaics, serving dishes shaped like animals, recipe tablets detailing absurd flavour pairings, that suggest some Romans really did lean into culinary surrealism. You sip from a goblet shaped like a chicken, and listen as a guest recites an ode to his favourite loaf of barley bread. You're not sure if he's mocking the poor or genuinely loves bread. That's the magic, or the curse, of this type of dinner. You never quite know what's real. Was the fish-shaped cheese a joke or a delicacy? Is the wine actually wine or some kind of fermented pomegranate reduction? Is the host laughing with you or at you? The answer probably is yes. By the time the final course arrives, a roasted fig wrapped in rose petals and served on a tiny silver bed, you're too far gone to question anything. You eat it. It's delicious. You think, maybe. The host leans in and says, "That wasn't a fig." You laugh. He doesn't explain. You don't ask. The meal ends not with applause, but with a philosophical debate about whether food exists without perception. One man argues that flavour is memory. Another insists that eating is a form of art theft. Someone throws a pickled plum at someone else. The lyre player sighs and begins playing a funeral dirge for a fallen onion. As you stumble out into the night, your mind swimming with metaphor and your stomach full of edible irony, you can't help but appreciate the strange genius of the Roman literary feast. It's satire you can taste, a parody served hot with a side of poetry and a dessert that may or may not be an insult. You look back one last time. The lights are still glowing, the host is still laughing, and you, slightly buzzed and deeply confused, have become one of Rome's favourite stories, the outsider who came for a meal and left unsure if they'd actually eaten anything at all. You're deep in the countryside now, far from Rome's marble colonnades and garum-slicked banquets. The air smells of dry grass and pine, and the only things louder than the cicadas are the shouts of a small hunting party preparing for their evening meal. You've been invited to what they call a Silvestre Cena, a wild dinner, hosted by a local landowner who's proud to show that Rome's extravagance hasn't dulled his appetite for things that still kick when you catch them. There's a hare slung over a wooden post, its fur matted with burrs and drying blood. Nearby, a young boy skins a wild goat, his hand steady despite the occasional wince, and just beyond the olive trees, you spot something you're not entirely prepared for. A boar, freshly killed, steaming in the cool air as two men argue about how best to cook its liver. "Stuff it with apples and herbs," one says. "No, leave it raw and slice it thin," says the other. You stand very still, reconsidering your life choices. Tonight the menu is drawn straight from the woods: hare, boar, goat, wild doves, and, if they're lucky, some wolf meat. You blink. "Wolf?" you ask, as casually as you can. "Don't worry," says the landowner, a burly man with grease already on his chin. "We don't eat the whole thing, just the heart. For strength." You nod. Of course. Just the heart. That makes it perfectly normal. In ancient Rome, wild game was more than just food. It was prestige on a plate. Hunting was a noble pursuit, a symbol of control over nature, and an excuse to drink heavily in the woods. And when you caught something rare, wolf, lynx, wild ass, you didn't just eat it. You made sure everyone knew you ate it. A roasted boar was expected. A roasted wild boar from your own land, however, meant power. The first course is hare, roasted whole over an open flame, its legs crisping as the fat renders and drips onto the coals. It's seasoned with nothing more than salt and a sprig of rosemary, and when you bite in, the flavour is rich, gamey, and slightly bitter. It tastes like what it is, an animal that spent its life dodging predators, not lounging in a pen. It chews like it remembers that. Next comes the goat, cut into chunks and grilled on sticks, then dipped into a sharp sauce of vinegar, garlic and coriander. The meat is tough, full of connective tissue, but the flavour is deep, earthy and tangy with the sauce. You eat around the bits your teeth can't conquer. There's laughter, music, and the occasional outburst as someone insists the doves were absolutely fatter last season. You start to relax, for now. Then comes the centrepiece, the boar. Spit roasted for hours, its skin blistered and lacquered in honey and wine, the scent of charred fat clinging to your clothes. The meat is carved off in thick slabs, each piece smoky, sweet and a little wild. You're told the best part is the cheek meat, soft and gelatinous. You nod, because saying no isn't an option anymore. And yes, eventually, they bring out the wolf's heart. Small, dark and roasted until the edges are crisp. A symbol more than a meal. The landowner takes the first bite, chews and passes it down the line. You take your portion, just a sliver, and chew thoughtfully, pretending not to notice the stares. The taste is iron heavy, like a liver with a vengeance. You swallow it, slowly. The men nod. You're one of them now, or at least you didn't spit it out. Here's your weird historical nugget. Wolves were both feared and respected in Roman culture. Romulus and Remus were raised by one after all, but eating one? That was pushing the boundary between admiration and domination. The idea was simple. To eat something wild was to take its strength, its instincts, maybe even its soul. If that sounds theatrical, that's because it was. Rome didn't do modesty, not even in the woods. There's debate among historians about whether Romans regularly consumed wolf meat or if it was more symbolic, like lion meat at modern novelty restaurants where it's illegal but still whispered about. Some argue that the mentions of wolf in Roman texts were metaphorical or satirical, used to show just how uncivilized certain people had become. Others point to scattered references in provincial records, suggesting it wasn't completely unheard of, especially during feasts that prioritized bragging rights over tenderness. The final dish of the night is a stew made from wild greens, onions, bits of dove meat, and something the cook calls forest truffle, which might just be a chunk of dirt that smells faintly of garlic. It's served in a cracked ceramic bowl with a hunk of stale bread to soak up the broth. It's earthy, strange, and deeply satisfying. Maybe it's the wine, or the stars, or the adrenaline still buzzing from that bite of wolf, but you feel more grounded than you have in weeks. The men toast again, this time to Mars, to the hunt, and to all the things worth chasing. You raise your cup and try not to spill it on your tunic, which now smells permanently like smoke and ambition. As the fire burns low and the laughter turns into slurred songs, you sit back, belly full and nerves humming. This wasn't a feast for show. It wasn't plated for applause or garnished with metaphor. It was blood, fire and survival dressed up as dinner. And for once, you didn't feel like a guest. You felt like a Roman. You don't exactly plan to start your morning wrestling an octopus, but Rome has other ideas. You're down at the Emporium, the bustling riverside market where fishmongers shout louder than senators, and the air is heavy with the scent of seawater, brine and ambition. It's barely sunrise, and crates of sea creatures are being unloaded from flat-bottom boats, hauled in with nets, ropes and the occasional boot to the stern. Everything glistens, fish scales wet stone your forehead. And that's when you see it. A massive octopus, half out of its basket, its arms flailing with slow-motion menace as a fishmonger tries to shove it back in with a paddle. "It's fresh," he says, grinning, still trying to escape. You stare, it stares back. For a second you feel like you're in a duel. Then it flicks water at you with one of its suckered limbs. That counts as a challenge. Octopus was a known delicacy in Rome, prized for its rich flavour and the effort it took to prepare. The Romans called it polypus, and didn't shy away from serving it in elaborate ways. Boiled, grilled or stewed in vinegar and spices. In coastal cities and river towns, a good octopus dish could earn a cook more praise than a perfectly roasted duck. But the catch had to be fresh, still twitching if possible, and this one, very twitchy. You're invited to a small colina, a back alley kitchen run by a woman with arms like marble columns, and a laugh that rattles your ribs. She specialises in seafood, and today she's making octopus a la apicius, slow simmered with white wine, coriander, lovage, and a small dollop of honey. She holds up the octopus, its limbs dangling like knotted ropes, and slaps it twice on the stone counter. "To tenderize," she says, then slaps it a third time just for good measure. While it simmers, she tells you how the best octopi are the ones who've lived long, clever lives, ones that escape traps and change colour. "Smarter the octopus, the better it tastes," she insists, stirring the pot. "You're not just eating meat, you're eating strategy." You think back to the market octopus and its rebellious glare. You definitely just consumed someone's war general. When served, the dish is rich, soft, and deeply flavoured. The wine and honey create a kind of glaze that sticks to your lips, while the meat itself, if you don't think too hard about suction cups, chews like a marriage between chicken thigh and squid. You eat slowly, carefully, watching the cook pick her teeth with a fishbone, and mumble about how modern Romans can't handle real food anymore. Here's a delightful little sidebar. Some elite Romans kept exotic sea creatures, octopuses, moray eels, and rare fish, in ornamental tanks not just to admire but to later eat. There's a recorded case of a noblewoman naming her octopus Minimus, feeding it figs and crustaceans, only to later serve it braised with mustard and date paste to a roomful of delighted guests. You wonder if anyone mentioned the name over dinner, but it wasn't always high cuisine. Octopus was also cheap and accessible, especially for fishermen, sailors, and anyone living near the coast. It could be salted, dried, and rehydrated in stews, or chopped up into garum-based pastes that doubled as sandwich spreads for the brave. Its reputation depended on the context. In some kitchens it was a showpiece, in others a necessity. Either way, it stuck to your ribs and your memory. The fringe fact that adds just the right amount of disturbing spice. There were rumours, likely apocryphal but disturbingly persistent, that certain Roman taverns used live octopuses in drinking games. The story goes that you had to retrieve a coin from a bowl filled with brine, fish guts, and a small angry octopus. If you got bitten, you drank twice. If you didn't, you probably still needed a new set of fingers. Scholars debate whether this was real or just a particularly vivid bar joke passed around by bored scribes. Either way, you make a mental note to avoid party games in coastal inns. And then there's the scholarly debate. Some culinary historians argue that octopus was more a curiosity than a staple, appearing mostly in seaside villas or among cooks who prided themselves on the unusual. Others point to its frequent inclusion in preserved recipes and merchant records as evidence of its popularity, especially among middle-class Romans with adventurous tastes and strong stomachs. The truth probably lies in the middle. Like most Roman food, octopus travelled through class lines, shape-shifting to match the expectations of whoever happened to be paying for dinner. After lunch, you return to the market, cheeks pink from wine and seafood steam. You spot another basket, this one filled with smaller octopi, their limbs limp but their eyes still glassy. A merchant offers you one for a few coins, claiming it brings luck. You politely decline. You've met your quota for sentient dinners this week. As you walk away, the woman from the Colina calls after you. "You see one in your dreams tonight, don't be scared. That means it liked you." You laugh, but as the sun sets and the shadows lengthen across the Tiber, you find yourself glancing over your shoulder more than usual. Because now you know, in ancient Rome, even dinner might come with tentacles, and it might remember your face. The gladiator barracks are not where you expect to eat your next meal. They smell like rust and sweat and too many unwashed bodies jammed into tight stone quarters. You're ushered in past the training yard, where shirtless men are pounding wooden swords into sandbags and shouting at each other in a dozen dialects, their arms roped with muscle and their legs caked in dust. A few glance at you, some with curiosity, some with the blank look of men who've seen too many visitors come and go with soft hands and clean sandals. Today, you're here to taste what fuels them. And spoiler, it's not steak and glory. You're handed a bowl. It's heavy. Inside is a porridge so dense you could stand a spoon upright in it. It's grey, flecked with what looks like bone dust and smells faintly like ash and roasted grain. The man who gave it to you, one of the senior trainers, with a nose flattened like a worn coin, grins and says, "This is what keeps us from dying. Sometimes." This is Hordiari fare, literally barley men, a nickname for gladiators because of the amount of barley they consumed. Unlike the elite who feasted on flamingo tongues and pomegranate lamb, gladiators ate with one goal in mind: survival, endurance, recovery. Their diet was surprisingly plant-based, built on heavy portions of barley, legumes, and a sludge-like drink made from vinegar, water, and wood ash. You take a bite of the porridge. It's warm, coarse, and sticks to your teeth like guilt. The ash hits on the back end, a gritty mineral tang that makes your tongue retreat toward the back of your throat. You chew, you swallow. Your jaw already feels stronger from the workout. The ash isn't decorative, it's intentional. Burnt animal bones or plant materials were ground into fine powder and added to food and drink as a source of calcium and minerals, thought to toughen the body, heal bones faster, and replenish the iron lost during a particularly bloody match. A kind of ancient protein shake, if protein shakes tasted like ground campfire and punishment. Nearby, a young gladiator gnaws on a hard cake of barley mixed with dates and beans. No sugar, no salt, just fuel. He shrugs when you ask about it. Better than dying, he says, and you honestly can't argue. Here's a fun little detour. Roman physicians actually studied gladiator diets. Galen, one of the most influential doctors of the empire, noted that gladiators tended to be surprisingly healthy despite their brutal lifestyle. Thanks in large part to their high-fibre, high-carb meals, their bodies were padded with a layer of subcutaneous fat, which may have helped protect vital organs from slashing wounds. It's not glamorous, but it's effective. You start to see why they weren't dining on honey-glazed peacock. But don't think it was all porridge and bone dust. Some gladiators did get access to meat, especially after a victory or during festivals. Goat, pork, even fish, usually grilled over open flames with little to no seasoning. The taste was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the protein and the ritual. A gladiator biting into flesh was an echo of what he did in the arena. The quirky historical fact of the day. Some Roman sources mention that retired gladiators would continue eating the same porridge long after their fighting days were over. Out of habit, maybe, or superstition, or perhaps because they didn't trust any other food not to betray them. You're handed another bowl, this time of posca, the infamous vinegar drink. It's a mix of stale water, wine dregs, and sour vinegar, sometimes with herbs or even egg whites added. The taste is sharp, like someone fermented disappointment, but it rehydrates and cuts through the heaviness of the barley. Soldiers drank this too. It was the Roman Gatorade, cheap, acidic, and reviving in its own aggressive way. There's a debate among scholars about how scientific this gladiator diet really was. Some believe it was carefully engineered to maximise healing and endurance, supported by generations of medical observation and trial and error. Others argue it was just the cheapest food available that could fill a stomach. No one really knows how much intention went into it versus sheer practicality, but either way, it worked. You sit for a while in the shade of the barracks wall, watching two young fighters spar with wooden swords, their bare feet kicking up plumes of dust. The trainer sits beside you, gnawing a barley cake with all the enthusiasm of someone chewing leather. The body breaks, he says flatly. Then you eat. Then it breaks again. You nod. It's not poetry, but it's honest. The more time you spend here, the more you realise that food in ancient Rome wasn't always about status or pleasure. Sometimes it was armour, a way of building walls inside the body against the violence outside. Every spoonful of ash-thickened porridge, every vinegary gulp of posca, every tooth-breaking barley biscuit, they weren't meals, they were tools, strategies. When you finally leave, someone presses another barley cake into your hand. It's wrapped in cloth and still warm. In case you fight later, they joke. You nod solemnly and slip it into your satchel, next to the dream fig you still haven't touched. You walk away with the heavy, unshakable sense that the next time you chew something, you'll wonder if it's trying to make you stronger, or simply keep you alive. In Rome, food has many faces. Tonight it was one of grit, bruises, and slow-burning resolve. The villa you arrive at today is unlike any you've seen. There's no gleaming marble atrium, no prattling poets sipping saffron wine in shaded courtyards. Instead, it feels more like a quiet museum of conquest, tucked into the hills of Campania, filled with oddities collected from the farthest edges of the empire. The owner, a soft-spoken equestrian with the brittle smile of someone who's spent too long explaining his hobby, greets you in a room decorated entirely in giraffe motifs. You think it's a theme. Then you realise it's a menu. He offers you a seat beside a table so long and polished it reflects the clouds from the open ceiling. At the centre sits a massive silver platter covered with silk. The servants remove it with a practised flourish. What you see is confusing. Slices of something pinkish-brown arranged into the rough outline of a reclining beast. At the head, a carved wooden giraffe bust gazes into the middle distance like it's questioning its life choices. "Boiled giraffe," the host says, almost too casually, "in cumin, fig and rosewater sauce. Rare, I know." You blink. Then you smile, the way people do when they're trying not to offend someone with a potentially criminal palate. Boiled. Giraffe. The meat is sliced thin and laid over grilled onions and lentils. You're handed a silver fork and a goblet of pear wine, and no one says anything as you take your first bite. It's soft, tender even, but carries a faint bitterness that clings to the roof of your mouth. The sauce helps. Sweet and earthy, hiding the slight tang of something that feels unfamiliar. You chew slowly, swallowing the bite and your pride at the same time. Here's where things get weird. There's no concrete evidence that giraffe meat was widely consumed in ancient Rome. There's barely any at all. Giraffes were certainly brought to the empire, famously gifted to Julius Caesar and other notables as living trophies from Africa. But whether they were ever served as food, especially boiled in fig and rosewater sauce, is a topic of heated academic debate. Most likely they were displayed for wonder, not supper. But that doesn't stop your host from insisting. "It's authentic," he says, gesturing to a clay tablet nearby. "A recipe passed down from my grandfather's travels near Leptis Magna." You glance at the tablet, which could just as easily be an ancient grocery list. The script is smudged, the Latin sloppy, but it's just credible enough to maintain the illusion. The thing is, Romans would have done this, if only for the story. Exotic animals weren't just entertainment in amphitheatres, they were status symbols. A living giraffe wandering your gardens. Opulent. A dead one on your plate. Divine. If you could procure it, cook it, and serve it with enough ceremony, no one would question whether it was real. They'd just be impressed that you had access to something no one else did. That's the real meal here. Prestige. The host recounts how the giraffe was imported from Alexandria, travelled overland with a personal handler, and was only slaughtered after it had lived a good life. You nod slowly, suppressing the suspicion that this meat may actually be something much more common, perhaps camel or even goat, masquerading under an exotic label. Because in Rome, everything could be faked, as long as the performance was convincing. Here's your quirky detail for the day. Ancient Roman banquets sometimes featured mock meats, where ordinary animals were disguised as exotic ones using dyes, mouldings, and precise carving. Pork shaped like fish, chicken painted to look like pheasant. There are even records of a boar being dressed up to resemble a tiger, complete with painted stripes and a pomegranate in its mouth as a fake heart. The point wasn't always flavour, it was reaction, and that's what tonight feels like. You're not eating giraffe because of the taste, you're eating it because of what it implies. Wealth, reach, audacity. Later in the evening, the second course arrives. A stew made from what the host claims are giraffe marrow bones, served in tiny cups of clay. You sip it, and it's rich, almost cloying, with cinnamon and leeks. It tastes like every bone broth you've ever had, but darker somehow, deeper. You're not sure if that's culinary design or just your imagination filling in the blanks. There's a toast to empire and appetite, and you join in, raising your goblet with just the right amount of theatrical reverence. Around you, the guests chatter about trade routes, about rare spices from India, about the difficulties of importing flamingo tongues when the weather turns bad. It's all very academic, and very absurd, and deeply Roman. As the sun sets and torchlight flickers across the silverware, you realise you're full, not just from the food, but from the spectacle. This wasn't a dinner, it was a monologue, an edible boast. You still don't know if you actually ate giraffe. But you do know you've just been served a story, marinated in ego and plated with precision. On your way out, the host presses a wax tablet into your hand. "Copy of the recipe," he says, "in case you wish to impress someone." You smile, tucking it into your satchel, right next to the barley cake and the prophetic fig. Your stomach is a museum now. As you walk away, the stars blink awake overhead. You wonder how many other Romans dined on mystery meat, convinced it was the stuff of legend. Maybe they knew, maybe they didn't care. Maybe, like you, they swallowed the myth along with the bite and found it just as satisfying. You're deep in the marble guts of an imperial palace now, and everything smells suspiciously sweet. Not the comforting kind of sweet like warm honey or figs baking in a clay oven, but a sharp, flowery sweetness that clings to your tongue before you've even eaten anything. It's the kind of smell that makes your skin crawl while your brain whispers, "This is fancy, this is powerful, this is dangerous." You've been invited to a private dinner hosted by a courtier with close ties to the emperor. No names are exchanged because this isn't the kind of gathering where you're supposed to know who everyone is. You just sit, smile, and hope you leave with the same number of organs you arrived with. There are only a few guests, senators, advisors, and at least one man whose tunic is stitched with imperial purple, which means he could have you executed with a yawn. Excellent. The meal begins with delicately sliced mushrooms, pale and glossy, arranged in a spiral on a black plate that looks like obsidian. They're soaked in oil, dusted with pepper, and served cold. You hesitate. Because you've read enough Roman history to know that mushrooms in these circles aren't just food. They're weapons. Famously, Emperor Claudius may have been poisoned with mushrooms, most likely by his wife Agrippina, who had a strong interest in seeing her son Nero on the throne. Some sources claim she fed him Amanita phalloides, the deadly death-cap mushroom, disguised as an expensive delicacy. The kind that kills slowly, gently, giving you just enough time to say something ironic before you keel over. The kind that could be passed off as food if you weren't paying attention, or if you trusted the wrong person. You don't have the luxury of trusting anyone in this room. The man to your left, lean, sharp-nosed, and impossibly bored, lifts his mushroom slice with silver tongs and chews it like it's the most ordinary thing in the world. You follow suit. The flavour is mild, slightly nutty, and very well oiled. Not offensive, not immediately lethal, which is almost disappointing. But the danger lingers, because this isn't just about mushrooms, it's about the art of the deadly dinner. In ancient Rome, food was one of the most elegant and insidious methods of murder. It left no bloody tunics, no obvious trail, and, if done well, could be disguised as an unfortunate bout of indigestion. Especially when combined with wine, which masked the taste of nearly everything. Hemlock, belladonna, henbane, even lead. You don't need a sword when you can use a stew. The second course arrives, a delicately roasted quail, stuffed with herbs, and a soft, buttery paste made from crushed almonds, and something faintly floral. It melts in your mouth. Too good, too smooth. You glance around the room. No one else looks concerned, or maybe they've just mastered the art of chewing without fear. Here's your quirky historical wrinkle. There were entire professions in ancient Rome dedicated to poison and antidotes. Veneficae, often women, were feared and respected as herbalists and poisoners. Some noble households even employed private tasters and apothecaries, not just to prevent death, but to administer slow, strategic ones. Death wasn't always instant. Sometimes it came days later, disguised as fever or stomach illness, a delayed punishment, an elegant revenge, and it wasn't always personal. Sometimes food was used to test loyalty. A dish might be served only to a certain guest. If they refused it, suspicious. If they ate it, brave or foolish. Sometimes people survived the poisoning only to suffer years of illness, their health fading while their enemies smiled politely over dinner. Modern scholars still argue about the prevalence of food-based assassination in ancient Rome. Some claim it was exaggerated by historians eager to make political death seem dramatic. Others point to the sheer number of suspicious imperial deaths and say, come on, it's obvious. The truth, as always, is murky. Coated in oil, garnished with mint and served on a silver tray. Back at the table, dessert arrives. Something absurdly beautiful. Slices of pear poached in wine, dusted with cinnamon and gold leaf. It sparkles. You hesitate again. This time, not because you fear poison, but because you know better than to think beauty equals safety. The host raises a goblet and toasts to enduring appetites. Everyone drinks. You sip your wine slowly, knowing full well that if someone wanted you dead tonight, they would have started with something you couldn't resist. Maybe it was the mushroom, maybe the quail, maybe it's in the wine you're still holding, maybe it's in the pear you haven't touched, maybe it's not even food, maybe it's trust. The meal ends without ceremony. The guests rise, exchange vague nods, and drift back into their silken lives. No one drops dead. Not yet. You step into the cool night air with your stomach heavy and your senses sharpened. You're not poisoned. Or if you are, it hasn't kicked in. Comforting. You make your way through the palace corridor, passing servants with blank faces and trays stacked with leftovers. Somewhere behind you, someone coughs. A little too hard. You don't turn around. You realise something. In Rome, food isn't just nourishment or indulgence. It's a test, a stage, a battlefield. Every dish can be a message, every bite a risk. And sometimes, the finest dining is the deadliest. You breathe deeply and step into the street, feeling both alive and very aware of it. You've survived the banquet, for now, but you'll never look at a mushroom the same way again. By now, your palate has survived more Roman culinary chaos than most emperors. You've chewed through barley bricks, stared down vengeful octopi, and narrowly avoided being murdered by mushrooms in a room full of decorative giraffes. So it's fitting that your final meal doesn't come from a palace or a market, or even the smoky guts of a gladiator barracks. No, your last Roman food adventure begins where all things do in this city, at a funeral. It's a modest affair, not a senator's funeral with ivory chariots and trained mourners, but a working man's send-off. You're told he was a carpenter. Strong hands, good temper, better wine collection. His friends gather under an olive tree dressed in dusty tunics, their expressions solemn but not crushed. The man's ashes are sealed in a terracotta urn, placed gently on a small stone pedestal surrounded by offerings. A handful of coins, a cup of milk, and several loaves of bread that look like they died of natural causes weeks ago. Someone hands you a bowl and gestures toward the low table in the centre of the gathering. It's covered in dishes, some simple, some suspicious. You spot boiled eggs, still in their shells, cracked slightly open to release their aroma. There are dates stuffed with nuts and fish sauce, a tray of lentils cooked until they resemble brown glue, and then, at the centre, something that looks like it might actually still be breathing. A cake made of spelt flour, wine and goat fat, moulded into the shape of a human face. The lips are slightly parted. You try not to make eye contact. This is a Silicernium, the traditional Roman funeral meal. It's not about flavour, it's about memory and debt and the complicated way Romans honoured their dead by feeding the living with food the deceased might have loved, or hated, or simply tolerated because it was all they could afford. You start with the lentils, because that seems like the safest option. They're bland, vaguely earthy, and stick to the roof of your mouth like regret. A man beside you says, "They represent the cycle of life," then adds, "Also, they're cheap," which is probably the real reason they're always on the menu. Next, you try the dates. Sweet, soft, with a salty bite from the fish sauce. A jarring combo, but one that clings to your tongue like an awkward farewell. You imagine the carpenter eating these at his workbench, leaning over blueprints, licking the syrup from his fingers. It's strangely comforting. Here's your strange fact for the night. Some Romans believed that spirits could be nourished by scent and memory alone, that the act of sharing a meal in someone's name, especially with strong smells like eggs, garlic or vinegar, could keep the soul satisfied on its journey to the afterlife. Food wasn't just tribute, it was fuel, for the living and the dead. The eggs are next. Cold, overcooked, but oddly satisfying. You peel the shell, revealing a slightly green yolk, and dip it in a sauce of honey and herbs. A woman across the table explains, "Eggs are a symbol of transition. Life to death. Death to whatever comes next." You nod, mouth full, wondering if symbolic food always tastes like this or if death just dulls the seasoning. And then there's the cake. Someone pushes a slice toward you. The texture is rough, dense from the spelt, greasy from the goat fat, slightly sour from the wine. It crumbles when you pick it up, leaving your fingers sticky. The face carved into it still haunts you. You eat it anyway, because in Rome, you finish what's placed in front of you, especially at a funeral. There's quiet conversation around the table, stories about the carpenter, the time he built a bathhouse door so perfectly balanced it could be opened with a breath, the way he always brought extra olives to a dinner party, how he once claimed to have tasted flamingo liver and thought it was fine but overrated. Someone toasts to that. To simple food, they say, and good liars. Here's where the historians squabble. Were these meals truly about honouring the dead, or were they just an excuse to gather, gossip and eat food no one would serve on a normal day? Some argue the Silicernium was deeply spiritual, a ritual of passage rooted in the ancient Roman fear of being forgotten. Others suggest it became routine, one more civic obligation wrapped in symbolism and bad lentils. Either way, there's a peculiar intimacy to it. This isn't performance dining or status flaunting. There are no boars stuffed with songbirds or cheese moulded into mythical creatures. Just real people, real grief, and food that remembers. As the meal ends, a man pours a final libation, wine splashed onto the earth, and murmurs something too soft to catch. The urn sits silently, the sun warming its clay surface as if it too is digesting. The guests begin to drift off, one by one, tucking crusts into their satchels or slipping coins back into their pockets. The woman who brought the eggs wraps the leftovers in linen. Someone whistles a short tune, off-key but sweet. You stay a moment longer, chewing the last of the date, staring at the crumbs on your plate. You realise this might be the truest Roman meal you've had yet. Not because of the ingredients, but because of what it meant. Nourishment, memory, community, and the quiet, unsettling knowledge that you too will someday be remembered over lentils. As you walk away, the sky shifts from pale gold to a dusky purple, and the scent of the meal lingers in your clothes. Garlic, honey, a touch of smoke. You feel full in a way that has nothing to do with your stomach. Because in Rome, even death has a taste, and tonight you've finally learned it. You find yourself back where the journey began, alone, under the fading warmth of a Roman sunset, the smells of ash, vinegar, herbs and memory clinging to your robe like shadows. Your feet ache, your stomach is either full or confused, and your satchel feels heavier than it should. Inside are the trophies of your edible odyssey, a hardened barley cake from the gladiator barracks, a wax tablet scribbled with a possibly fictional giraffe recipe, and yes, still, that one dream fig, untouched. But now, somehow, even more sacred. You settle beside a fountain, one of those trickling marble ones with a chipped lion's face and a lazy drip that keeps time better than any sundial. You breathe in the scent of the city, smoke, stone, wine, something slightly fishy, and exhale slowly. For the first time you let yourself rest. It's strange to think how much a civilization can say with its food. Rome wasn't just an empire of columns and conquests, it was an empire of cravings. It wanted everything, sweet, sour, foreign, forbidden. It turned meals into theatre, hunger into politics, kitchens into laboratories, and sometimes into battlefields. You've tasted that hunger. You've seen how it stretched from taverns to tricliniums, from the crowded guts of the Subura to the hushed, dangerous calm of imperial courts. You've chewed through metaphors and marrow, cracked bones, braved questionable cheeses, and swallowed pride more than once. You've seen food used to build strength, seduce enemies, mock rivals, honour the dead, and outlive the forgetfulness of time. Because Rome wasn't about simplicity, it was about spectacle. And food? That was the grand finale. And yet, some of the most unforgettable moments came from the quietest plates. A chunk of stale bread soaked in cheap wine, a bowl of lentils eaten in mourning, a humble porridge that kept someone alive long enough to win, or survive, a fight. Those too were Roman meals, maybe the most Roman of all. As night settles and the stars wink open overhead, you wonder which tastes will stay with you. Not on your tongue, but in your bones. The tang of ash from gladiator gruel, the salt-slick bite of octopus eaten like a dare, the sweetness of honey drizzled over something you'd rather not name, or maybe just the smoke that floated over every hearth, every pot, every meal, binding the empire together with its own strange kind of seasoning. You close your eyes, listening to the rhythm of the fountain, the soft steps of passers-by, the distant clang of a kitchen closing for the night. Tomorrow, Rome will rise again in a swirl of dust, drama, and overcooked lentils. But tonight you've seen it clearly, not in marble or myth, but in flavour, in strangeness, in 1,000 edible stories. And you realise something else. You've survived. Barely, but still.